Chapter 12 of 6 Years in the Prisons of England, by a Merchant, edited by Frank Henderson. This recording is in the public domain. Chapter 12. How rebels against society are made. I am removed to a small room amongst murderers. The high flyer again. How a young gentleman was made a warning to others. A certain class of criminals, it would be very wrong to say all, may be looked upon as rebels against society, and assuming that they are so, it would be difficult to conceive a more effective method of promoting and disseminating the spirit of rebellion than that which is adopted in our convict establishments. We collect all these rebels from the various counties into a few localities, 600 here, 1,000 there, and 150,000 somewhere else, and along with them we place a certain proportion of comparatively untainted men. We subject them to a course of rigorous discipline in matters of diet and exercise, the sole effect of which is to stimulate them still more against society. We allow them a certain amount of intercourse with each other, liberty to the old to contaminate the young, to the veteran ruffian to enlist and drill the new recruit, to all to plan their new campaigns and hatch new conspiracies, and then disperse them throughout the country to sow the seeds of sedition, and rise the standard of rebellion wherever they may go. This is really what is being done in our convict prisons. Take an extreme case, and keep out of sight altogether the characters and dispositions of our criminals, and imagine 100 of England's most steady, honest, and industrious working men placed in our convict establishments for a few years, and what would be the result? It would most probably be this: if they were young and had only received an imperfect education, 50 of them would join some branch of the thief profession if kept by force in convict society for 3 years. 70 of them would do so if kept for 6 years, and if kept 10 years they would almost all be corrupted, and become, when liberated, a source of corruption themselves. But if the hardened and incorrigible criminals were really punished in any proportion to the others, the system would have a kind of consistent iniquity about it which it does not possess. My left-hand companion was an old agricultural labourer, one of a large class to whom a convict prison is no punishment. He had been brought up to work, and although an old man he could work far more than a city thief, and yet not hard work. He had brought up a family who were all scattered abroad. He had now no real home when out of prison, and his third penal sentence of 14 years was very much lighter punishment to him than 14 days, with loss of character, would be to anyone in the upper or middle classes of society. I met many such men in prison, and I used to ask them how much money they would take to do my sentence in addition to their own. One would say 100_l., another 50_l., another 40_l., and some would even take considerably less. Imprisonment with hard labour will never have the slightest effect in deterring such men from committing crime. Labour that would soon kill many other men would not punish them, but they would prefer it even to sitting in school. Rough fare they can do with, as long as it fills the belly. They have no other ambition to gratify. With the stomach distended and a quid of tobacco in their mouths, they are as happy as kings, and very careless about liberty. Many of them, when they leave the prison, leave home. To such men, and to all the class of vagrant and pauper criminals, a convict prison means a comfortable home, where they are fed and clothed, and bathed and physicked, and have all their wants supplied, without trouble or care, in exchange for their liberty and such labour as they can easily and cheaply perform. To the professional thieves a convict prison is a court of bankruptcy, to be avoided if possible, and to be made the most of when unavoidable. A place of punishment, no doubt, but punishment nearly useless and entirely misdirected. To the man who has wrought for his living at some honest trade, up to the commission of his first known offence, who has been accounted respectable by his neighbours, and who belongs to a class of society with whom loss of character is utter ruin, a convict prison is a hell. If he happen also to be a man of thought and education, it will in addition appear to be an institution for robbing honest taxpayers, and a nursery of vice and crime, which all good men should endeavour to reform or destroy. In the small room to which I was now removed, the lodgers were quiet, inoffensive men, and in a few cases apparently religious. During my residence in the prison, I was frequently moved from one room to another, to suit the convenience of the prison authorities. Fortunately I had no rent to pay, no economy to study, no opportunity to practise honesty, and my effects were easily carried about. Obedience, the soldier's virtue, and civility were all I had to study, and these were not difficult to practise in my own case. One class of prisoners in these rooms were elderly men, who had committed murder or manslaughter, and who, from their age and infirmities, had missed being sent to Western Australia. I knew upwards of 20 of them, and generally speaking, they were quiet, inoffensive men, with no inclination to steal or to do wrong. Several of them had very hot tempers, all of them indeed, who committed their crimes under the influence of anger. Others I sympathized with a good deal, inasmuch as they had been sorely tempted, and seemed penitent and honest. One of them had brought up a family of honest working men. After the death of their mother, he married and lived with another woman, who was addicted to intemperance, and he was so annoyed at her conduct and by her tongue, that his passion obtained the mastery over him, and in a moment of frenzy he killed her. This prisoner had had his arm broken at Portland, which prevented his being sent abroad, whence he would have been liberated by this time. Another case was that of a comparatively young man who shot his sweetheart because she had chosen another man just as the prisoner was looking forward to his marriage with her. He tried to shoot himself at the same time, but the shot passed through the jaw and cheekbones, leaving him in a sadly disfigured condition, to meet his doom of penal servitude for life. I met several cases where murder was committed through jealousy. One man murdered his wife for flirting or cohabiting with another man. A second murdered the paramour and spared his wife, and so on. In the majority of these cases the prisoners were very unlikely to commit a second offence. There was one very peculiar case which I will here mention. The prisoner was the worst cripple perhaps in the prison, and the quietest man in it. He rarely spoke to anyone unless he was first spoken to, and his answers were very brief. This man committed a deliberate murder, although he had only one arm and but one good leg. He lay in wait for his victim, and his motive for perpetrating the deed was not money but revenge. The person he killed had injured or defrauded his father before he died, and being unable to obtain justice, he took revenge, and is now paying the full penalty. He sits in the workroom along with the others, but being paralysed, he is not compelled to work at anything. Another peculiar case was that of a man who had starved his mother to death, in order to obtain possession of her money. He was a miser, and was often taunted for his crime by the thief fraternity. He was the filthiest neighbour I ever had. Most of the prisoners are cleanly in their habits, but this one was the reverse. he would have his food stored away beside him, rather than give it to a fellow prisoner. He was not a great eater, and at one time there was more food about than the prisoners could consume, but whatever he got he kept until it was taken from him. After being confined for about 13 years, he was allowed to go to North America on a conditional pardon to a son who lived there. Among the many petitions I drew out for prisoners to copy, his was the only one that ever succeeded. I have written petitions for dying men to the Home Secretary, for permissions to go out and die at home, and many without any just grounds at all, but none succeeded, save the one I have mentioned above. I have repeatedly asked prisoners under sentence of penal servitude for life whether they would prefer that sentence to being hanged. The general reply was, I would rather be topped at once and be out of my misery, than remaining in prison all my days. It's bad enough when I have the prospect of liberty in 12 years. If they are going to keep men in prison all their days, and torture them besides, they'll commit suicide or murder in prison. Look at Townley, who threw himself over the stair railings at Pentonville and killed himself. Such would be the answers I would receive to my questions on this subject. With reference to Townley's case, I was told by an intelligent prisoner who knew him and saw him commit suicide, that it was committed mainly in consequence of the cruel, absurd, and childish system of suppressing a prisoner's letters to his friends, on grounds usually hostile to the interests of society, viz., the concealment of truth. Another class of prisoners were coiners. These were generally flymen. They knew every point of the law on the subject, and as a rule returned to the profession as soon as they got their ticket. Prison is no doubt a great punishment to such men, because they can make a good living at their business, but I question if ever there was a reformed coiner. They are usually well conducted prisoners, that is, they are civil and do what they are told, but their influence over others is very pernicious. A very considerable number of the convicts left the prison with the intention of hawking from place to place, and doing a little bit on the cross when they saw the coast clear, which meant either stealing or snide pitching. These hawkers found friends in the coiners, who would tell them where they could get the bad money, so that if they could not work themselves, they could do a friend a turn in the way of business. I knew several instances of prisoners with a first conviction getting a second in consequence of being told where to get bad money, and I knew many more who will, in all human probability, meet with the same fate from the same cause. Another of my fellow prisoners was a singular specimen. I have already referred to him as being almost the only high flyer in the prison, as being the man who once obtained 150_l. from a gentleman in Devonshire under false pretences. This man was not ranked among the aristos in prison society, although he was in many respects their equal or superior in certain branches of education. And here I may remark that on parade, where all the prisoners exercised together, they associated in classes as they would do outside, the roughs, the prigs, the needy mizzlers, and the aristos, keeping not always, but pretty much among themselves. There were only a few of the class termed aristos, and they comprised men who had been clergymen, merchants, bankers, editors, surgeons, etc. These were usually my associates during the exercise time. Now the high flyer I have referred to did not belong to this class, but except in his principles and habits and tastes, his education was quite equal to theirs. He spoke German and French fluently, knew Latin and Greek, a smattering of Italian, and the higher branches of mathematics. What first surprised me about him was his pretended intimacy with some German merchants of the highest standing I knew in London, and with whom I had done business. To know such men I afterwards found was part of his profession. He could tell me not only the names and titles of the nobility and gentry, but the names of their families, where many of them were educated, to whom they were married, and many other particulars of their private history. His sentence was 3 years, and I believe he got it something in this way. He had been in the country following his profession, and had obtained some money, I think £30, from a gentleman of his acquaintance. In the country he was the Reverend Dr. So and so, with a white necktie, and all the surroundings of a clergyman. In London he was a "swell" with a cigar in his mouth. It so happened that the benevolent gentleman from whom he had obtained the money came to town and recognised the doctor when cutting the "swell," and had him apprehended and punished. He had been several times in county prisons, but as he always changed his name and his localities, this fact was not known officially. He was an avowed infidel, and seemed to delight in spreading his opinions among the prisoners, who were generally too willing to listen to him. If he keeps out of prison, it will be his cleverness in escaping detection, and not his principles, that will save him. His prison influence was most pernicious, and afforded another striking and painful illustration of the evils of the indiscriminate association of prisoners. I maintain that it formed no part of any prisoner's sentence that, in addition to all the other horrors of penal servitude, he should be placed within the sphere of this man's influence as such as he, and the system which not only permits but demands that his moral and religious interests should be thus imperilled, if not altogether corrupted and destroyed, undertakes a fearful responsibility. The next case I will notice will illustrate the truth of what I have advanced on this point. It was that of a young man, who had been respectably educated, and whose crime was simply the foolish frolic of a giddy youth. He had engaged a dog cart to drive to London, a distance somewhat about 50 miles from where he resided. He had another youth for his companion, and they both got on the spree in London. Some shark picked them up, and bought the horse and dog cart from them at a merely nominal price. When they got sober they returned home, and this youth went and told the proprietor of the dog cart what he had done, and, according to his own statement, offered through his friends to pay for it. The proprietor was so enraged, however, that nothing but the prosecution of the prisoner would satisfy him, and he was sentenced to 10 years' penal servitude. He had the character of a fast youth, and met with a severe judge. The prisoner might have been easily led into the path of honour and usefulness, if the attempt had been honestly made. Whoever this judge was, if he were an Englishman and father of a family, he would never again pass sentence of penal servitude on such a youth for any offence against property, if he knew, as well as I do, what the sentence involves. Shut up any such man for 7 years in a place where the only men of his own age are city-bred thieves, and what can be expected of him? This young man elected the smartest and cleverest of the London pickpockets for his companions. They made a tool of him in prison, and unless his friends have managed to get him sent abroad, he is very likely acting as a stall for some of his old companions now. He never learnt anything in prison except knitting. He was also one of the readers, but most of his time was spent in hospital. He could spit blood when he chose, and the doctor being more liberal to him than many others, for several very natural reasons, the prisoner used this liberty to benefit some of his pals who could not manage to get the good things they wanted from the doctor otherwise. in return for this kindness he would get an inch or two of tobacco, or snout, as it was usually termed. When other means failed to procure this luxury, he would write to his friends for a toothbrush and sell it for the weed, which caused the toothbrushes to be withdrawn from all the prisoners. Then he would write for a pair of spectacles, pretending that his eyes were getting weak. These he sold, and the last were discovered passing into one of the cook's hands in fair exchange for mutton chops. They were taken into the governor's room, and after being examined by that potentate, they were laid on his desk, and next morning they were nowhere to be found. They were stolen, but not by a prisoner. Of course P. knew nothing about his spectacles, when examined on the subject, except that some one must have taken them from his shelf. The result was that all spectacles belonging to the prisoners were called in, and prison glasses issued in their stead. The spectacles were intended ultimately to reach the hands of an officer for tobacco, and if they had not been removed from the desk, the officer might have got his discharge and the prisoner a severe punishment. This was one of the 1,001 schemes which prisoners resort to in order to get snout, and without the aid of an officer they can get none. This youth was intended by his parents for the church, but was trained in prison to be a thief, as a warning to others, and his was far from being a solitary case. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of 6 Years in the Prisons of England, by a Merchant, edited by Frank Henderson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 13. The Act of 1864, Classification of Prisoners, the Mark System, its Defects, the true criminal law of restitution, the only method by which confirmed criminals may be reclaimed, workhouses. The year 1864 was a marked epoch in convict life. A new Act was then passed and fresh prison regulations were brought into force. This Act contained one good clause, viz., the abolition of 3 and 4 years' sentences. In 1 year as many as 1,800 men were sentenced to 3 and 4 years' penal servitude, being a large proportion of the total number. Such men are now for the most part sentenced to 18 months and 2 years' imprisonment, which will account for a decrease in the number of convicts and an increase in the number of county prisoners. This is a short step in the right direction. The convict directors take credit to themselves for this reduction in the number of convicts, and boast that they have at last found the true panacea for criminal disease. A report to that effect, cut out of a newspaper, was circulated amongst the prisoners, and their indignation was great at the way in which the public were gulled about themselves and prison treatment. No doubt a few more thieves and burglars are driven to pursue their callings in France and America by the operation of the new police regulations, and I freely admit that a few more may annually be sent into another world by the same means, but no one can yet point to a reformed professional cracksman, coiner, hoister, or screwsman, as proof of the beneficial results of the change. The most unpopular clause in the Act was that relating to police surveillance. The majority of the prisoners were very much annoyed at this regulation. Some of them, indeed, would much rather have remained in prison than encountered it. For my own part, I approve of the principle of surveillance. I see in it the germ of a system whereby a large class of criminals may ultimately be punished entirely outside the prison walls. I object, however, to the police being entrusted with the duty. Their proper business is to catch the thief and preserve order. The surveillance of liberated prisoners ought to be entrusted to those who are directly interested in empty jails, and who would endeavour to assist the liberated men either in getting employment or to emigrate. With reference to the classification of prisoners which commenced under the Act of 1864, I have no hesitation in saying that it is a gross fraud upon the public, a delusion and a snare. The error which I pointed out in a former chapter as being committed in the selection of convicts for transportation, is here repeated and in a more aggravated form, if that were possible. By the new Act the prisoners were divided into 4 great classes. Into the 4th, or probation class, all prisoners were required to enter on being admitted into prison. After a certain time, if the prisoner was so fortunate as to escape being reported for any offence against the prison rules, he would be placed in the 3rd class, and again, after being a certain time in the 3rd class, he was passed, subject to the same condition, into the 2nd, and so on. Should he have made any mistake and allowed himself to get reported, he either missed his chance of getting into the higher or was degraded into a lower class. The object of this classification, no doubt, was to get all the well-behaved men together, but the blunder committed was in making obedience to the prison rules the only test of qualification for the higher classes. This, as I have already explained, was really worse than no test at all, because the frequently convicted criminal, who was thoroughly posted up in all points of prison discipline and regulations, was more likely than the novice to escape being reported for violation of them. The consequence is, that in respect of character, disposition, and moral quality, there is really no difference to be found amongst the men in any of the classes. The scheme operates in this way. Suppose that a clergyman by some mischief gets sentenced to penal servitude, and enters the prison in company with one of the very worst villains that could be selected out of our criminal population. Both these men, the one with a first sentence, the other with a long string of convictions against him, entered the probation class at Millbank on precisely the same terms. The jail bird, knowing all about the ways of the prison, would probably pass with ease into the 3rd class. The clergyman, being new to the discipline, might make a mistake and get reported, and in that way would not be so likely to reach the 3rd class so soon as the other, but granting that he did so, they would still be together. The man inured to guilt and crime would still be beside the new and casual lodger. The man who had never been in prison before would still have the opportunity of learning the evil ways of the confirmed rogue. Again, should the clergyman be fortunate enough in passing into the higher classes at the usual time, the jail bird would certainly not be behind. If 1,000 prisoners from all parts of the country, of all ages, habits, and antecedents, were brought to one of our convict establishments, they would go through their time in the same way, good, bad, and indifferent altogether. The clergyman, even if he were to get into prison innocently, and were the best Christian in the world, would never get rid of the jail bird, and in the highest class his companions would be no better than those in the lowest. I grant that our directors could not classify convicts according to their real merits, any more than a quack doctor could classify patients suffering from disease. But although they cannot have the knowledge necessary to do it properly, they might do a little in the right direction. The quack, even, would know colic from consumption, diarrhea from dropsy, so any man of any sense would be able to distinguish between a case of chronic moral disease and a case of partial or temporary paralysis of the moral faculty. The system of marks, as it is called in prison, is the most prominent feature in the new regulations, and is based upon the same absurd principle as the classification clause. The rule relating to marks specifies that the time which every convict under sentence of penal servitude must henceforth pass in prison will be regulated by a certain number of marks, which he must earn by actual labour performed before he can be discharged. The method adopted is to debit the prisoner with a certain number of marks, according to the length of his sentence, and if he performs the whole of the work required of him, he is credited with as many marks as would represent a fourth part of his sentence. If this law were carried out in its integrity, it would be most cruel and unjust. Fortunately for the prisoners, it is not very strictly adhered to, at least not at the prison where I was confined. The officers make an allowance for the prisoner's infirmities. To show how it would operate, let us take the case of the clergyman and the jailbird once more. Assuming that the former was a stout and healthy man, and able to work, but not having been accustomed to it, really not able to do much of it, and that the latter had been at the work for years, which would win in the race for liberty if the law was strictly enforced, the probability is that the clergyman would not earn a single day's remission, whilst the jailbird would get 1/4 of his time remitted, and assuming that both had the same sentence originally, would go a considerable way into a fresh bit before the poor clergyman had finished his first sentence. The mark system admits of great cruelty being practised, but on the whole, as it is carried out, it is a more innocent piece of deception than the classification. At the public works, however, there is much injustice done by it, no allowance being made for a sick man, unless he has met with some accident. If the marks were money, bona fide sovereigns, and if the prisoner were permitted to exercise the abilities God had given him in order to earn that money, there might be some sense and justice discernible in the system. As it is, there is neither. I may here venture to say that we might materially diminish crime and expense connected with the prosecution and punishment of criminals by doing away with our convict establishments altogether, except for the confinement of political prisoners and those having sentences for life. In lieu of these, I would suggest the introduction of the system of remissions into our county jails, granting first offenders a liberal, and third and fourth an extremely small allowance, teaching the prisoners such trade as they were fitted for, qualifying them for colonists, and selecting the most suitable for emigration. I would also place the jails and workhouses under one management, commissioners for the prevention of crime and pauperism in each county, and subject them to a rigid government inspection by a board responsible to Parliament and the nation. But even this would only be a partial reform. I would have our criminal laws based upon the old Mosaic principle of enforced restitution, and carried out on the Christian principle of making the offender pay the uttermost farthing. Then we could fairly and justly retain the idle and the useless in the net of justice, and allow the willing and industrious to achieve their own freedom by satisfying the claims of the law. Now, when time has been strangled and virtue repressed, we allow the worst villains to escape, and all that has been required of them in prison was civility to officers, obedience to a stupid discipline, and a few years' work, which neither enables them to support an honest livelihood outside of the prison, or contributes in any appreciable degree to their maintenance inside. Under the system I propose, every man who stole a sheep would have to pay the same penalty before he could exercise the rights of citizenship, no matter whether his character was good, bad, or indifferent, no matter whether he was rich or poor, a peer or a peasant. The voice of impartial justice would say, you have incurred the same debt to the state, and the same penalty must be paid. At present every man who steals a sheep has to pay a different penalty. This man is sentenced to 6 months, that other to 12 months, and then another to 15 years of penal servitude, according to the discretion of the judge, and instead of being made to pay the price of the sheep and the costs of his prosecution, he becomes a grievous burden to the honest taxpayer, who has to supply him with chaplains, schoolmasters, surgeons, cooks, bakers, tailors, and a whole host of servants in livery to minister to his wants, and so unfit him for the practice of economy, frugality, and other kindred virtues when his fetters are cut. Under a law based on the principle of restitution, the man of good character and industrious habits might be able to find sureties to enable him to discharge his debt to the state under the surveillance of the authorities, without being surrounded by prison walls. The man of middling character might only have a limited amount of liberty, such as the responsible authorities might grant him, whilst the man of bad character would have to discharge his debt inside prison walls, where he might still continue a villain in habits and heart, and increase his debt by fresh acts of dishonesty, but this would be his own fault, and the safety valve of the machinery. But to return to the Act 1864, if the labour performed under the mark system was either remunerative or such as a convict might obtain an honest living at when liberated, the system could not be condemned as utterly bad. But if we except the tailoring and the shoemaking done for the use of the establishment, there are really no other employments suitable for the general class of men who find their way into prison. The professional thief, and I am now speaking of the reformation as well as the punishment of criminals, requires to be taught some trade for which he has a natural aptitude before it is possible for him to gain a livelihood, and he must be taught it well, for unless he is a skilled workman he would not be worth the wages necessary to keep him out of temptation. To go on punishing such men in the hope that we will make them honest is absurd, and to persevere in reforming them without teaching them practically that which is indispensable to their remaining honest is equally ridiculous. We may train a boy to be a labourer of almost any sort, and can impart moral and religious instruction to an unformed mind with success. But if we attempt to do either of them with a confirmed thief who has not been taught to work, we must be disappointed in the result. The first step to reformation is to interest him in some employment suitable to his abilities, and any other step taken before this only hinders or prevents the work of reformation. We have never yet taken this first step, consequently we have never yet succeeded in reforming any of them. It is also essential that such work should be also well paid, and that the money made at such employment should be his passport to liberty. Under the present system we only make him kill time at labour, which disgusts him with all kinds of regular industry. The county prison sentences are, moreover, too short to enable the thief to earn such a passport to freedom, but they are of just the requisite length and fitness for turning the casual into the confirmed criminal. In fact, time sentences are not suitable for confirmed thieves. Their sentence ought to be so much money to be earned in a penal workshop, where honesty and economy could be practised as well as industry. There are two grave objections urged against teaching thieves lucrative trades. Firstly, it would tempt others to commit crime, and secondly, it would interfere with free labour. With regard to the first objection, I admit there would be some force in it if the sentences were such as they are now, because time runs on, whether the prisoner is industrious or not. But if the sentence imposed a fine in addition to all the expenses incurred by the prisoner during his incarceration, there would then be no inducement to the commission of crime. With reference to the second objection, I would merely state that all labour done in prison of a useful character interferes with free labour to some extent, but I contend that if each prisoner was employed at that kind of work for which he is best qualified, it would interfere less with the proper and necessary division of free labour than the present plan of keeping a large number of men employed at work for which they have no special aptitude. The error we have made in employing prisoners hitherto is not merely that we have employed them at trades or other employments not suitable to their natural abilities, but that we have entered into competition with those trades where too much competition already exists. We should never have allowed smart young pickpockets to compete with poor seamstresses, whose ranks are already overcrowded. There will always be plenty of honest people descending in the social scale to do underpaid work, and there are thousands of petty thieves who are not fit for any other, so that there is a greater need for elevating the clever professional thief to the position of a skilled artisan. The city breed thief class are far from being dunces or flats, and it is not possible to make them common labourers. Many of them may very fitly be compared to the idle and dissipated swells of the middle and higher classes. If we took a fast young nobleman, for instance, and put him into some office agreeable to himself, so that he conceived a decided liking to harness, it would do him a deal more good in the way of reforming him than a course of lectures on the seventh commandment. And assuming that by so doing he enticed other swells to buckle on official armour, it might interfere with the prospects of some who had never been fast, but on the whole, society would benefit by the change. I maintain that that would be the correct method to adopt with some of those thieves who are totally irreclaimable by our present system of prison discipline. With regard to the casual and petty thieves, their case is somewhat different. Many of them could not be raised above the lowest class of common labourers, but by adopting a system of individualization, that is, studying each man's natural abilities, we could always arrive at the best results. It might be advanced as a third objection, that it would be impossible to make thieves pay their expenses in prison, and a fine in addition. Under our present system I admit it would be very difficult, but in the penal workshops into which I would turn all our prisoners, this objection would not hold good. The prisoner would then be stimulated to labour at paying work agreeable to his tastes and suitable to his abilities, and the cost of his maintenance would be less than it is at present. Those who really could not earn a living in the penal workhouses, and those who would not earn their living, I would transfer to the prison for criminal incurables. I would not have any first offenders against property in prison. I would punish them as ticket of leave men. In the penal workshops I would only have persistent thieves. In the convict prisons only great offenders against the person and traitors. All the persistent criminals of the petty class I would consign to the workhouses, but the character of our workhouses would require to be altered. There are three distinct classes of paupers. 1. Those who have become paupers through no fault of their own. 2. Those who have become paupers through vice. And 3. The vagrant class. I would refuse admission to the workhouse to the first class, just as I would refuse admission to the prison in the penal workshops to first offenders against property. I would treat them on the family system of out-of-door relief, as the deserving poor. The second class I would admit into the workhouse, and the vagrant class as well, but on the understanding that they did not get out again till they had paid their bill. In short, we ought to make our prisons and our workhouses paying concerns, and with the former there need be no difficulty whatever. Above all, we ought to keep the deserving poor from the other classes, and the regular thieves from those who have only erred once. Every man found guilty of crime who can prove that he has been working an honest calling up to the time he committed it, should be prevented from mixing with confirmed criminals, or even from going into prison, unless for some great crime against the person for which enforced restitution would not be a sufficient atonement. Chapter 13. Chapter 14 of 6 Years in the Prisons of England, by a Merchant, edited by Frank Henderson. This recording is in the public domain. Chapter 14. The new arrangements as to remissions, artificial legs, another interview with the visiting director, composed verses, hospital once more, Fenians, prisoners' letters. Asking pardon of my readers for the rather serious digressions I have made in the preceding chapter, I now return to my narrative. Shortly after the new regulations were made known to the prisoners, I wrote a letter to my brother, and in this solitary instance, I confess in a somewhat ironical strain, and as a matter of course, the letter was suppressed. I remember one passage in it was to the following effect: "A new arrangement has lately taken place, which grants to all frequently convicted prisoners with the same sentence as myself 2 years of unexpected remission, so that if they should deal as leniently with me, I shall soon be home." This was an allusion to the repeal of an old regulation whereby convicts who had revoked a former licence were thereby disqualified for receiving any remission from a subsequent sentence. Prisoners, therefore, who had so disqualified themselves, had been re-convicted under the old regulation, were quite unprepared for being placed on the same footing in all respects as those who had been convicted for the first time, which was actually the case under the new regulations. Prisoners conversant with the recommendation of the Royal Commissioners anticipated quite a different policy on the part of the authorities. They expected that men who had succumbed to strong temptation and who had never been in prison before would have been more mercifully dealt with, and that increased severity would have been visited upon those who had already had several opportunities of redeeming their character, but had fully proved their determination to continue in their evil ways. But the authorities decided otherwise. About this time there occurred a circumstance which I must mention. One of my fellow prisoners with a deformed foot asked the medical officer to amputate his leg below the knee. The request was complied with, and the patient, who was a very stout fellow, was provided with a mechanical substitute, with springs in the heel. This man's brother was a professional thief, and both are still in the same prison under different names. The artificial leg was altogether unsuitable for a man in his position in life, inasmuch as he would not be able to pay the expense of repairing it. That, however, I had nothing to do with. The leg was made by a prisoner, and being a nice looking article, it was exhibited to strangers in the doctor's room for a considerable time, to show them how kind they were to the prisoners, and to keep up that system, so dear to officials, of washing the outside of the platter for the public gaze, whilst all uncleanliness remained within. Another prisoner, who met with an accident at the public works, and lost his leg in endeavouring to save an officer's life, arrived at the prison and was also provided with a mechanical substitute. Feeling my health failing me, I thought that an artificial leg, by enabling me to take exercise, or get into the field to work, might save me from again being sent to hospital, and seeing other prisoners getting them, I resolved to petition the director for the same favour. I was further encouraged in my resolution by the fact that it was a new director who was then inspecting the prison. The visiting day arrived, and as before, I was ushered into the presence of the new official and placed between two warders with staves in their hands. At the desk sat the new director, by his side stood the governor, and in front of the desk the chief warder.
"Well, what do you want?"
I told him that I had lost my leg in prison, that I was feeling my health giving way, that I was anxious to be in a position to move about a little better, and would feel very grateful if he would allow me to have an artificial leg, the same as the other prisoners had. The governor endeavoured to deny that any artificial legs had been furnished to prisoners, but being prepared for something of that kind, I gave the particulars I have already mentioned, which were confirmed by the chief warder. The result was that the director promised to see the doctor on the subject. I was glad to see a disposition on the part of the new director to listen to the prisoner without any attempt to bully him, and became sanguine of the success of my petition. Next visit, however, it was curtly refused on the ground of expense. As it so happened, I was obliged to go to the hospital once more after the lapse of a few weeks, and swallowed as much quinine there as cost far more than an artificial leg, made by a prisoner whose labours at knitting was not worth a penny a day, would have done. The prisoner who lost the deformed leg began to use his artificial substitute, and 2 or 3 times it got out of repair. One of these repairs was said to have cost 30s. in London. In the long run it was broken, and an ordinary wooden peg leg substituted, which was the only one suitable to his position. I now began to be exceedingly depressed in spirits, and this depression operated prejudicially to my health. I began at this time to string couplets together as an exercise for my mind and my memory, and so great was the relief which was thus afforded me, that I ventured to compose verses in earnest, and succeeded in this way in partially forgetting my troubles. To keep them in my memory was the most difficult task, as it was quite contrary to the prison rules to write one's own compositions in a copy book. If John Bunyan had been unfortunate enough to get into one of our model prisons, the Pilgrim's Progress would have been unwritten. From this time up to the close of my imprisonment, I exercised my mind in the manufacture of verses, my stock ultimately amounting to many hundreds of lines, which my memory faithfully retained. My chest having now become very painful and weak, in consequence of so much reading aloud, as I was obliged to do on a somewhat poor diet, I was compelled to enter the hospital a second time, suffering from severe general debility accompanied by a cough, after having been about 13 months in the prison. On my admission I received a change of diet and tonic medicines. For some weeks I was confined to bed, and not till 6 months had elapsed I was discharged. An event took place during my second sojourn in the hospital which caused much excitement among the prisoners. This was the stabbing of a scripture reader by one of the patients. The case was afterwards disposed of at the Assizes, and the culprit was sentenced to 5 years' penal servitude. As his former sentence had as much to run, this was considered as a triumph on the part of the prisoner. He committed the crime not with intent to kill, but for the purpose of bringing his case before the public, and of being removed to another prison. He had committed a similar crime before, but the directors had disposed of it privately, so that, the particulars of it should not reach the newspapers. In this case to which I refer, the prisoner alleged on his trial that the doctor would not give him treatment for his complaint. He found that it was of no use complaining to a higher authority, that he could not get removed to another prison, nor procure the treatment he had been accustomed to receive for his disease. He was much beyond the ordinary convict in point of ability. He defended himself, cross-examined the authorities, and made some of the chiefs cut very sorry figures under the divining rod. He at last gained his point, for he exposed the authorities and obtained his removal to another prison, where he would have what he considered proper medical treatment, good food being an essential item in the prescription. After this case occurred, the governor was allowed to retire on a pension, or, in the language of the convicts, he got the sack in a genteel way. But in reality the doctor was a man on whom the responsibility rested, and it was him the prisoner wished to stab, and not the scripture reader, but he never could get the opportunity. I notice this case chiefly to show that our present law is inoperative in the case of a class of prisoners of which this one was a fair type. He was a sad cripple, walking with the assistance of 2 crutches, and dragging his legs behind him. He was afflicted with spinal disease and heart complaint. He had been a convict before, and had lived all the time like a fighting cock. Commanding medical treatment and working only as it suited himself, he had nothing to fear in the commission of crime except being sent to hospital, and his disease would compel the majority of doctors to give him good diet and good general treatment. If they had refused or neglected to do so, the prisoner's life would have been sacrificed. Whatever may have been the truth in his case, he felt and believed that his days were being shortened, and he was one of those who would rather have died on the scaffold than submit to a lingering death in prison. A short time ago he was found dead in his cell. It was asserted that he had taken some medicines internally which was intended for external application, and that he had thus poisoned himself. It was alleged that his object was to make himself ill in order to obtain better treatment. This is somewhat doubtful, but as his death took place at another prison, I am unable to give more particulars. The newspapers having commented rather severely on this stabbing case, it was deemed necessary by the prison authorities to have a counter-current set in motion. For this purpose an inquest was held on the body of a deceased convict. All the chief authorities were called to this special inquest, and 3 prisoner nurses were also examined, and the result appeared in the newspapers to the great astonishment of the prisoners. It was reported that the coroner had held an inquest on the body of a deceased convict, and found that the deceased had received excellent diet and medical treatment. He further expressed his surprise to find the prisoners received such luxuries in prison as fish, fowl, and jellies, in addition to wines, etc. If they had not mentioned the fish, fowls, and jellies, the prisoners might not have taken much notice of it, but the facts being as follows, it must be confessed that they had some grounds for making uncomplimentary remarks. For 32 or 33 months previous to the inquest, there had been no fowls in the hospital, and there never had been either fish or jellies served to patients during the whole period the prison had been in existence. Some time after the inquest there were 2 or 3 soles cooked for dying prisoners, one of them being a Fenian. After the arrival of the Fenians and a new priest, there was a considerable alteration in the hospital treatment. Fowls became quite common, apple pies, meat pies, and sundry other luxuries being introduced, fish and jellies being still wanting, however, to bear out the newspaper report. I do not wish it to be understood that the Fenians receive better medical treatment than the other prisoners, nor is their position generally much better. They sat at work in the same room with me. They had the privilege of exercising by themselves, but judging from their eagerness for my society and political conversation, they seemed to consider the privilege in the light of a punishment. One concession was made to them, however, which at first rather surprised me. They were allowed to write to their friends as often, when they were in the 3rd class, as other prisoners were allowed who were in the 1st, and the censorship over their letters was not very severe. One of the head centres and one of the principal writers and agitators in the would-be rebellious Sister Isle was a tall, bony, cadaverous-looking man, afflicted with scrofula. He could have ate double his allowance of food, and probably he required more than he was allowed. At all events he thought he was not getting proper treatment, and wrote a very strong letter on the subject to his friends. This letter was considered a libel on the establishment, but the governor and director decreed that the letter should pass, as it would show the Fenians outside that their friends in prison were not on a bed of roses. This was acting in quite a contrary direction to that which was usually followed with the correspondence of other prisoners. Any letter that told of the comforts of the prison and gave the friends of the prisoner the idea that he was in paradise was sure to pass, and the writer of it would also get into the good graces of the officials. But if there were any word of complaint, especially if addressed to any person of influence, the extinguisher was put upon it at once. I remember one of the patients writing to his friends that he was unwell, but that he really did not know very well what to say about his complaint, as one doctor told him to get out of bed and knock about, as there was nothing the matter with him, while another told him he was dying, and on no account to leave his bed, and between the two he did not know what to do. This was at the time when the two medical officers seemed to pull against each other. The letter produced an improvement in them, but it was never allowed to reach its destination. Another case was that of a Quaker's letter, the only one of the creed I met with in prison. He was a quiet old man, and for upwards of 3 years had been allowed certain trifling privileges on account of his religious opinions. One of them was his being allowed to sit when grace was said before meals. One day a young consequential officer happened to be on duty in the ward where the Quaker was domiciled, and when he called "attention" for grace, the Quaker, as usual, kept his seat. The officer ordered him to stand up, and the Quaker, having attempted to explain he was "reported," and besides being sent to chokey, forfeited some of his remissions for the offence. He wrote to an influential Quaker in the north of England, explaining the particulars of the case, but his letter contained one clause sufficient to condemn it in the eyes of the prison officials, and it was this: "Be good enough to send this letter to John Bright, Esquire, M.P." Chapter 14. Chapter 16 of 6 Years in the Prisons of England, by a Merchant, edited by Frank Henderson. This recording is in the public domain. Chapter 5. A very bad case. A self-taught artist. A clergyman, also a convict. The clergyman is taught tailoring. How we punish violation of the 7th commandment and the 8th. On one occasion during my second sojourn in hospital, my attention was accidentally directed to a pale, sickly-looking young man, who had just arrived with a number of other prisoners from Millbank, and whose appearance and manner so unmistakably betrayed the genius to which he belonged, that I decided to avail myself of the first opportunity which presented itself of learning his history. It so happened that he was located in the next bed to mine, and I had thus no difficulty in finding an occasion to gratify my curiosity, and the following dialogue took place on the first day of his arrival. "Well, what news have you brought from Millbank?" "Oh, nothing particular. The prison's full, and a good many back on their ticket." "How long have you done?" "9 months." "What's your sentence?" 7 years. "Have you done your separates in the bank?" "No, in the country, down in Somerset." "What sort of treatment did you get?" "Wretched. They are making it very hot now, and I got bashed as well." "The flogging has made your health bad, I suppose?" "Yes, it made me spit up ever so much blood." "Were you ever flogged before?" "Yes, twice." "Twice? Why, how old are you?" 23, and I have 2 leggings, and this is my 3rd, besides short bits in the county jails." "During your first legging, I suppose you had been among the boys at the Isle of Wight?" "Yes." "I think most of the Isle of Wight boys get into prison again. I have seen a great many now who did their first bit there." "Well, a good many of them went on the cross." "You belong to London, I suppose?" "Yes." "Did you get your sentence there?" "No, in Bristol." "How long were you out this last time?" 6 days, and I was half drunk all the time." "How long was your last sentence?" 3 years, and I did it all." "How did you lose your remission?" "For striking a screw." "Why did you not remain in London when you went out last?" "Well, these flipping fellows have alarmed the Londoners so much that there is no chance of getting a living at thieving." "You mean that the garotters have spoiled your trade by making people more guarded?" "Why, man, they are wearing steel collars and carrying firearms." "But they have passed a flogging bill in Parliament for all these crimes with violence." "Flogged be d d! D'ye think that would stop them? It's the people being always on the watch, and the bobbies more expert, that makes them afraid of being caught. But I wish they would never try that game, for it gives the buzzer no chance." "You say you have been flogged 3 times. How did you like it?" "The first time I was a kid, and cried like anything. The second time I never uttered a word, nor flinched in the least, and the last time I sang the bawdiest song I could lay my tongue on, and cried, 'Come on, ye!'" "Well, I think you are a very foolish fellow if you have permanently injured your health by your conduct." "I know that, but my temper won't let me be quiet, and by jingo, if this butcher does not treat me properly, I'll make him pay for it. I'll see now what the fish and the fowls and the jellies are like." "You appear to be consumptive." "Yes, 2nd stage." "Now take my advice and be as quiet as you can, and you will do very well here." "Well, if these fellows will let me alone, and the butcher gives me good treatment, I'll be all right. But I'll stand no nonsense. There's no 2 ways with me. Is there any snout knocking about? I have got some money, and if you can tell me how I can get it I will be glad." "I do not use it myself, but I see others dealing away in it, and I have no doubt that some of these fellows opposite will be able to put you on the right scent." This was one of the men who bring odium on the whole class of prisoners, and prejudice society against them. He was a thoroughbred professional thief, and in addition he was one of the very worst prison characters. His temper was very violent, and at times apparently uncontrollable. The lash had been tried on him, and, as in every case I met with, in vain. If he lives to complete the term of his imprisonment he will, as a matter of course, return to his old practices, the only method he knows of making his living. The officials were afraid he would stab or otherwise injure some of them, and he was petted and indulged a good deal at first. His diet was changed every other day, until they got tired of humouring him, and then he got into trouble. At last, after he had been about 18 months in the prison, and had insulted and threatened to strike the governor, he was suddenly removed to another prison, where he would no doubt repeat the same game. In all probability he will be in the grave before he is due for liberation. Yet with all this he could have been led like a child, but to attempt to drive him was out of the question. I confess I was very glad when he was removed from the bed next to mine to one further away. My neighbour on the other side was a very different character. He was a self-taught artist, and was gifted with considerable natural genius. His failing had been intemperance, and his crime a got-up case of rape. He was quite a philosopher in his way, always happy, always contented, nothing came amiss to him. Imprisonment was of no account with him. He was above it altogether. He had no inclination to break the law, and was most unlikely to enter a prison a second time. Yet this prisoner never could manage to get such good treatment as the other, simply because he was easily pleased. He looked upon the prison as a place of passage to be made the best of, not as a home. He could be liberated to-morrow with perfect safety to the public, whilst the other prisoner, who had precisely the same sentence, will go into the society of thieves and the pockets of other people, the moment he is permitted the opportunity. The artist, although a cripple, could have earned far more in prison than would have supported himself if he had been allowed to do so. The thief could not have supported himself honestly anywhere, and in prison he was never taught how to do so. Now suppose these two men had been sent to a penal workshop, each with a fine of 50_l. Upon his head, instead of to a human cage with a 7 years' sentence. Suppose that they were each debited, in addition to the fine, with the cost of their food, lodging, etc., and credited with their labour on the profits of their work, and liberated when the account was balanced. What would be the result? In all probability it would be this: that the artist, anxious for liberty, would economise, do with as little food and drink as possible, exert his faculties to the uttermost, and in a year or two perhaps he would have paid off the amount of his fine and the cost of his maintenance. He would then be liberated in a condition to benefit society, impressed with the folly of his conduct in having thrown away so much time and money, and determined to keep the law for the future. The taxpayers, instead of being as now burdened to support him, would not only be relieved of that particular grievance, but would have the satisfaction of seeing the criminal contributing large sums to the right side of the public ledger, instead of paying 250,000 of hard and honest earned money to maintain convict prisons, and ever so much more to the county jails. We might in time make them self-sustaining, and the offenders of the law a source of revenue to the country. If the casual offender regained his freedom in 2 years under such a system as I have indicated, when would one of the worst members of the most dangerous class regain his, and what would be his condition and prospects? He would certainly get deeper into debt to begin with, and if thoroughly determined to remain a dangerous and useless member of society, he would never regain his liberty. Perhaps he would commit an offence against the person, and being restrained and punished upon himself in every way unworthy of restrained freedom. But if he were resolved to become an honest and industrious man, the opportunity and the means for doing so would be before him. He would set to and learn a trade, practise economy, confine his hands to his own pockets, prove himself worthy of trust, and at the end of 4 or 5 years regain his freedom. He could never keep pace with the other in the race for liberty, nor would he be fitted for the proper use of his liberty until he had practised industry under a natural and healthy stimulus up to the paying point, the point when he becomes convinced in his own mind that honesty is the best policy. His prospects on liberation would then be very different from what they are under the present system. He would then be suited for being a colonist. It would have been proved to his own mind that he could make a living by honest industry, and in most cases this is the all-important consideration. Removed from his old associates, placed in circumstances where money can be made by industry, and still keeping the cost of his transportation against him to be paid out of the first of his own free earnings, society would then have done its duty by him. I wish to impress this strongly on those who take an interest in the subject of criminal reformation, and therefore repeat that if we can prove to the thief's own satisfaction that he can earn an honest livelihood at work agreeable to himself and suited to his abilities, we shall do much towards making him an honest man. But let us starve him, and lash him, and tyrannize over him, and we shall send him to the grave or the gallows; and if we combine statuesque and compulsory Christianity with such treatment, we make him in addition a hardened unbeliever and atheist. And yet hitherto we have sent such men prematurely into the other world, in such condition of soul and body, with as great complacency as if the blame were all their own. The next case I shall notice was a very different one indeed. The prisoner had been a clergyman in the Church of England for upwards of 20 years, and during that long period had discharged his duties to the satisfaction of his flock and his superiors in the church. I believe he had made an imprudent second marriage. His wife was beneath him in social position, and being inclined to habits of extravagances, had incurred debts which his small income could not meet. He used funds entrusted to his care by some society for the purpose of liquidating these debts, intending to replace them when his stipend became due. These funds happened, however, to be wanted much sooner than had been customary. He was not able to produce them, and the consequence was penal servitude for a very long period. I could not help pitying the prisoner. He had never rubbed shoulders with the world. An occasional evening with the squire's family, or in the homes of the less exalted among his parishioners, had been almost his only opportunity of gaining a knowledge of life. He was apparently very penitent, and often I noticed him shedding tears, a very unusual sight in a convict prison, and he seemed to feel his degrading and cruel punishment very keenly indeed. He was very kind to the prisoners, and was a great favourite with them, and in consequence not in the very best odour with the authorities. He was, like myself, employed as a reader in the workrooms, but was soon removed to another prison, where he was now employed tailoring. What can he do when liberated? I heard of 3 other clergymen who had been convicts. One of them went abroad after he was liberated, and soon afterwards died. A second went to a part of the country where he thought he would not be known, opened a school which was not very successful, got into good society, and for a time was very comfortable and happy. One day, however, a cabman who came to drive him to a gentleman's house recognised him as an old prison companion, and the fact having become known, he was obliged soon after to leave the neighbourhood. The third met with a fate somewhat similar. He happened to be at an evening party in the house of a friend. One of the guests would not remain in his company, and to save the party from shipwreck, he threw himself overboard into the great ocean of life. Perhaps some friendly fish has swallowed him and cast him on the Christian shore. I never heard of him again. The fate of these men gives rise to many sorrowful reflections. Surely there is cruel injustice in the law which condemns a minister of the Church of Christ, who in a moment of sore temptation breaks the 8th commandment, to years of slavery and a life of degradation and disgrace. compared with which death itself would be mercy and kindness, and yet permits constant and flagrant violence of the seventh by rich and titled transgressors to be compromised with gold. Why do we in the one case brand the offender with the mark of Cain, and in the other cover with a golden veil both sin and sinner? If it is necessary, as a warning to others, that casual violations of the 8th commandment should be so punished, why is it unnecessary to warn others against the frequent and habitual violation of the 7th? Would the payment of money, together with the loss of character, social position, etc., not be a sufficient warning to all men in a position to commit such acts of dishonesty as may be included under the general designation of breaches of trust? But what does so-called justice now demand in such cases? Let 10 clergymen embezzle 100_l. each, and hear how society indemnifies itself for the crime and the loss. By the mouth of one judge, one of these clergymen is sentenced to 1 year in prison. By the mouth of another judge, another of these 3 clergymen is sentenced to 2 years in prison. By the mouth of a third, another is condemned to 3 years penal servitude, to labour and associate with the dregs of society. By the mouth of a fourth, 4 years of such humiliation, and so on. Are all these just judges, or is only one of them just, and which is he? These are questions I will leave my readers to answer for themselves. Of one thing I am satisfied, that our present laws on the subject require alteration. Chapter 15. Chapter 16 of 6 Years in the Prisons of England, by a Merchant, edited by Frank Henderson. This recording is in the public domain. Chapter 16. Quackery. Food. A Chatham prisoner eats snails and frogs. Sir Joshua Jebb's system and its defects. I have already said in a previous chapter that our prison authorities regard the convicts as mere human machines, all made after the same model, and that the machinery, by some abnormal defect in its original construction, constantly impels them in the wrong direction. In official eyes they do not appear to be men having peculiarities of physical construction and constitution, individuality of character, or to have been so designed as to be like other men, moulded by circumstance, or amenable to the influence of education or social position. They look at him through the official spectacles, the lenses of which are carefully adjusted so that the object shall present not only a perfectly uniform appearance, but also appear uniformly bad. If the convict is in good health, the machinery working smoothly, but still by the defect in its construction always in the wrong direction, there are the regulation appliances, not for remedying the original defect in the machinery, it must be remembered, and if possible getting it to work in the right direction, but appliances to check, thwart, and by force drive it backward, which in most cases it cannot and will not do, and breakages, ruin of machinery and other appliances also are the only result. They number and ticket the convict according to his sentence, range them all up, count them 11 times a day, and say to them, "Convicts, now here you are, all ticketed and counted. All of you are afflicted with some moral disease. We are here to cure you, and we have one pill which will do it, and you must swallow it." This is the perfection of penal legislation, at which, after many royal commissions and much parliamentary eloquence, we have arrived. One would have imagined that a gigantic quackery and multitudes of quack doctors could have been procured and set in motion with less trouble and at less expense. only on one point there is universal agreement. Let the machine be working either in the right direction or the wrong, so long as it is working it must be oiled. That is a necessity of machine life, so to speak. The man or convict must be fed, but how feed him? To you, my reader, and I, the natural answer would be that the machine must be oiled, or the man fed, in greater or less proportion to the power and capacity of the machine or man, and to the amount of work we require from it or him. But we are both wrong. Our prison authorities say, machine, big or little, you shall all have exactly the same quantity of oil, neither more nor less. You little machines there, with oil running all over you, how smoothly and uncomplainingly you work. You big machines, you may creak as you please. Your journals may get hot, blaze up and produce universal smash, but you can't get any more oil. We can't allow you to lick up any of that which is running over your little neighbour there. That is for the pigs and for us. Is not this amazing folly? Or again, suppose we were to take a race horse, a dray horse, a farmer's horse, a broken down hack, and a Shetland horse, for these more nearly resemble the various classes of convicts, and say to them, horses, you have all offended the laws of horsedom, and stand fully convicted of clover stealing. For this most heinous crime you are each condemned to draw a load 1 ton weight, 15 miles every day, Sundays excepted, for 5 years, and your allowance of food will be 2 feeds of oats, and 1 allowance of hay per diem. And what would be the result, supposing that the allowance of hay and oats was just barely sufficient for the average, say, the farmer's horse? First of all, the race horse, able to eat his oats and a portion of the hay, could do with some additional dainty bits, perhaps, but on the whole he has his stomach filled and can live. He is yoked to his load, and being a spirited animal, he goes at it very hard, succeeds for a time, and at last he sticks in a rut, puts on a spurt, and breaks down. He can't do the work. He is put down at 6 marks a day, or no remission. He is spoiled for ever, and as a racer his days are ended. The dray horse comes next. The load is a mere toy to him. He gets his 8 marks a day, but by and by he begins to feel the effects of an empty stomach, to fill which he would require double the allowance of food he receives, and in the long run he too breaks down, and is passed into the hands of the veterinary surgeon, and is ruined as a useful animal. Next comes the farmer's horse, and the load and diet being suitable to him, he can do the punishment and easily satisfy the law. The broken down hack is never yoked at all. He passes into the hands of the surgeon and there remains. While the little Shetland is in clover, he never had so many oats before, has actually as much again as he can consume, and the cart and harness being too large, and the load altogether ridiculous for his strength, he is never put to it, and so escapes the legal punishment. And so it is that one portion of the inhabitants of horsedom, pointing to the Shetlander, cry out that the convicts have too much food, they are up to the eyes in luxuries. Another portion, pointing to the dray horse, say, the convicts are starved and are dying of hunger, whilst a third answers both by pointing to the farm horse and saying that he can do the work and satisfy the law. Why should they not all be treated alike? A horse is a horse, all the world over. Our system of dieting and working convicts is exactly similar to the above, only at the invalid prison where I was confined the law was not adhered to. I knew prisoners who ate double the quantity of food allowed them, and I knew others who did not eat above half. Sometimes it happened that a voracious prisoner could not get his food exchanged, so as to increase its bulk, and in that case he would be compelled to seek refuge in hospital. If the diet there was not sufficient, God help him, for from man no further aid was to be expected. I recollect having a conversation with a prisoner who had just arrived with 18 others from the prison at Chatham. He had got his leg broken accidentally while at work there, and the medical men had not made a very good job of putting the bones together, so that he did not expect ever to be able to use it. I asked him what sort of a place Chatham was under the new system. "Oh, it's the worst station out," he replied. "They are starved and worked to death. They are even eating the candles, and one man died lately who had 20 or 30 wicks in his stomach when the post-mortem took place. In the docks I have seen fellows pick up the dirtiest muck you ever saw and swallow it. There are lots of fellows there who could eat all the snails and frogs they can get hold of. I have seen one man several times swallow a live frog as easily as you could bolt an oyster. Frogs and snails are considered delicacies at Chatham." "How did you get on with the food yourself?" "Well, I was never much of an eater, and I could get on middling well with it, but then the food was better there than it is here. This is the worst station out for grub. The cook and steward must be damned villains to rob a lot of prisoners of their food." "Do they all get 8 marks a day at Chatham?" "No, not nearly all. Many only get 7, and some not more than 6. The screws there are bloody tyrants, and if they don't mind what they are about, some of them will get murdered. There are a few fellows there would rather be topped than be messed about in such a way, and have to die in prison at last. What sort of screws have you here?" "Well, the majority of them are very civil fellows. There are a few, perhaps, inclined to exceed their duty, but on the whole they are not bad, and you will have yourself to blame if you get into trouble. Bad masters make bad servants, and I have no doubt the Chatham officers are merely carrying out the director's orders when they tyrannise over the men." "What sort of a doctor is this you have got here? He gets a very bad name." "Well, he is blamed for not giving prisoners treatment until they are just dying, but I do not pretend to be a judge of such matters myself. My advice to you is to be civil and grateful, and do not bother him about food. Do not ask him for anything, just tell him exactly how you feel, and you may do very well here." The prediction as to the murdering of some of the officers made above by the prisoner was shortly after verified, and the culprit was hanged at Maidstone quite recently. At the Yorkshire prison they had what appeared to me a more sensible method of apportioning the diet. The prisoners were weighed once a month, and if any of them lost weight, they were allowed an additional quantity of dry bread to make it up. In the Surrey prison the practice of exchanging and trafficking in food amongst the prisoners counteracted the evils that would otherwise have resulted from the regulations being strictly adhered to, and in the Scottish prisons the use of tobacco appeared to have the same effect. While on the subject of diet, I may allude to a rule which had a very bad effect on the minds of the prisoners who expected justice at the hands of the officials. In the dietary scale brought out in 1864, it was specified that when a prisoner had been 2 years in prison, he would be permitted to have the option of tea and 2 ounces of bread in lieu of the oatmeal gruel for supper, and when he had been 3 years in prison, he might have roasted or baked meat in lieu of boiled. The convicts sentenced under the old Act were placed in the first or lowest grade in the scale of the Act of 1864, but were denied the option of those changes of diet which were permitted under it, and which were considered necessary for the preservation of their health by the medical authorities. The consequence was, and is, that there were prisoners with life sentences who had been 10, 12, and 16 years in prison on a diet inferior to those who had only been in prison 2 years. No tea and bread at night for them, and no roasted meat. This regulation was considered unjust by the prisoners, who said very naturally, they took us off the good diet allowed by the old act under which we were sentenced, and placed us on the lowest scale of the new dietary, and now, after being 2 years on the diet, we ought not to have been put on at all. We are not even allowed the changes open to other prisoners. It is scandalous, after being 10 or 12 years in a prison, to see other prisoners who have only just commenced their time much better off than we are, etc. Another grievance the prisoners had, of which they loudly complained. It was the custom at the Home Office to forward the prisoners' licenses to the prison once a month, but as a rule these documents were 10 days, sometimes 3 weeks, later than they ought to have been. If a prisoner had earned his marks, and was due for his licence, say on the 1st of March, he expected the authorities would keep faith with him, and that his licence would arrive on the day it was due. Whatever the convict may be himself, he expects a good example and honourable fulfilment of the engagements on the part of the authorities. In this, however, he was often disappointed, and many a million curses were heaped upon them in consequence. And after all, can we wonder at a convict being exasperated if, as it often happened, he had written to a wife or a father or brother or sister to meet him on a certain day at the railway station when he was due for his liberty, and then was disappointed and had to wait a fortnight or 3 weeks before he could see his friends? This neglect on the part of the authorities at the Home Office had the effect of making all those who were due for liberation early in the month quite regardless of the prison regulations, as one short sentence would not have made any difference to them under the circumstances. In Sir Joshua Jebb's day anything of this kind seldom happened. The prisoner's chief grievance then was the robbery of his food by the officers, and as the discipline was lax a mutiny would be the result. This had a good effect for a short time, and as long as the attention of the press was directed to the question, but matters soon became as bad as ever, and it was not until the subject came before the criminal courts that there was any improvement. The name of Sir Joshua Jebb is still held in great veneration by the convict, but as the duty of carrying out his system was entrusted to men of a totally opposite character, it was impossible for it to succeed. Independent, however, of its moral administration, it had defects inherent in itself. No penal bill will suit all moral complaints, and the sooner we depart from quackery, the better it will be for the prisoner and the nation as well. Sir Joshua Jebb's system entered too largely into competition with our workhouses and county jails. The prisoners were never taught suitable trades. They were no doubt supplied with food in abundance, and with some opportunities of learning to be industrious and for improving their minds, but they were completely surrounded by far more powerful counter-influences. Even the higher officials carried on a system of wholesale robbery, and winked at the very large retail business done in the same line by the prisoners and under officials. At Bermuda and Dartmoor convict establishments, I believe there were more crimes committed by officers and prisoners together than the prisoners could or would have committed if they had been at liberty. Prisoners could do very much as they liked in those days, and the consequence was that the roughs, or the worst characters, gave the ton to the whole prison. A country bumpkin who had stolen a bag of potatoes perhaps soon learned the theory of picking pockets and the art of garrotting in these places, and being unequal to the former he would adopt the latter as a means of earning a livelihood. Another cause of the increase in the number of garrotting cases was the conduct of the directors who visited the prisoners and punished the prisoners. Their injustice and incivility to prisoners bore a striking contrast to the mild and dignified civility of Sir Joshua their chief. I have known prisoners return from the presence of a director, foaming with inward rage at being bullied out of the room and punished without being permitted to utter a word in their own defence. In many of these cases I have known the prisoners to be innocent. Such men would go out of prison vowing vengeance on someone, and ready for any deed of darkness that might tempt them. I do not wonder that they took to garrotting when I reflect upon their character and the treatment they received in prison. Prisoners seldom, if ever, vow vengeance against a judge or magistrate. The objects of their wrath are some policeman who has sworn falsely, or some other witness who has committed perjury or betrayed them, and we may naturally seek to inquire why the prison judge is not as favourably regarded as his learned brother who holds open court. I believe the reason is this, that a prison director can starve and flog and retain prisoners in confinement for years, according to the length of their respective remissions, and none but those directly interested in full and quiet prisons know anything about it. If the governor and directors of prisons had to dispense justice in presence of a reporter for the press, how great would be the reformation immediately effected. To the prisoner it would also be welcome, for if it ensured him of nothing else but civility, it would be a boon. A civil word goes a long way with a convict, and it is so seldom he gets one from the chiefs of prisons, that he is apt to place a value upon it beyond its real worth. Chapter 16. Chapter 17 of 6 Years in the Prisons of England, by a Merchant, edited by Frank Henderson. This recording is in the public domain. Chapter 17. A new governor, bread and water Jack, severe punishments, directors again, a herb doctor, extraordinary story. During my second stay in hospital, a governor from another prison came to rule over our establishment. He was known to most of the prisoners as Bread and Water Jack. Some called him Captain Spooney, some the Lurcher, and others Mr. Martinet. The patients had just completed their out-of-door exercise, and were standing in file 2 deep, when he first made his appearance. Some of the prisoners whispered, "That's the new governor," and the sound having reached his official ear, the order was issued, "Now you men, you must understand there is to be no talking in the ranks when I pass you." Almost every week some fresh order issued from the new governor, and the following may be taken as a fair example of the weighty matters which troubled the official head, and afford a very good idea of its qualifications for disposing of them. Prisoners must roll their neckerchiefs twice round their necks and tie them in a particular way, and their way is then described. Prisoners must walk 3 abreast around the parade, and not pass each other in walking. Prisoners must be sure to keep their hands out of their pockets in the coldest days. Prisoners must not neglect to salute the governor when he passes them. Prisoners must walk only 2 abreast instead of 3 abreast as formerly ordered. The spoons and platters must be placed in this particular way, and next week the order came to have the spoons and platters placed in exactly the opposite way. Prisoners' hair must be cropped shorter. They must not go to bed so soon as they have done. They must cease talking at work, and so on. These were the principal orders issued, and attempted to be carried out. I say attempted, for some of them were regularly evaded or broken by the prisoners, and winked at by the officers. These were the orders that were expected to be instrumental in converting thieves into honest men. Whatever opinion might be formed of their probable efficiency out of doors, or the sanity of the man who sat in his office and scrawled them out, the thieves themselves mocked and ridiculed them, and called the small-minded military man set over them a balmy humbug. Footnote 20. Insane. End of footnote 20. What does it matter, they would say to each other, how we walk? What does it matter whether our neckties be once or twice round? Why don't they teach us to get an honest living and show us a good example? What good will all this humbugging do us? We don't want to come into such places if they will only let us live when we are out. Why don't they find us work and try to keep us out of prison? Ah, that would spoil their own trade. Someone would reply. Such criticisms passed between the prisoners on these new orders, with an accompaniment of oaths which I cannot repeat. The punishment for prison offences now became more severe under the new governor, and the following may be taken as fair examples of the manner in which this class of offenders were dealt with. A convict just about due for his liberation had half an inch of tobacco given him by another prisoner. The officer happened to notice the gift, went to the prisoner, found the contraband article upon him, and took him before the governor. That gentleman sentenced him to 10 days in the refractory cells, and recommended him to the prison director for the loss of his gratuity and 3 months' remission. The unfortunate prisoner was by and by called up and informed that in addition to the governor's sentence he was condemned to lose all his gratuity money, which amounted to about 30_l., and 3 months of his remission. 2 sentences for one offence were getting very common, but this prisoner happened to be one of those who cared very little about liberty, and received the information very coolly. As soon as he was out of the cells he had his snout again as usual, but he was chaffed a good deal by his pals for neglecting to swallow the quid when he saw the officer coming to him. One of the hospital nurses, a convict, got punished, though not quite so severely, for appropriating to his own use a mutton chop that he was ordered to carry to the pigs. At that time the authorities kept swine, who got all the food the patients could not eat, but now it is sold. The prisoner thought, I presume, that the chop would do a hungry man more good than it would an overfed pig. Another prisoner was sentenced twice for having an onion on his person. One of his fellow prisoners, who was working among these luxuries, gave him one, and as the officer in charge had a grudge against him, he was taken before the governor, who gave him 10 days' punishment, to which the director afterwards considerately added 3 months. Such offences as these were of daily occurrence, but the punishments for them when detected were very unequal. It is not often a convict is flogged, but it does happen occasionally. I remember a young rollicking Irishman being flogged for attempting to strike an officer, who, as often happens, was far more to blame than the prisoner, who in this case was goaded and tempted to strike. The majority of the officers, who are civil and sensible men, considering their position in society, would have acted very differently. Another case where the prisoner not only attempted but did actually strike his warder rather severely met with a more lenient punishment. In this case the prisoner was decidedly to blame, and his punishment, in technical language, was 6 months in chokey with the black dress and slangs. These cases were usually disposed of by the director at his monthly sitting. That gentleman, who was fond of having nothing to do, generally spent about 24 hours in prison per annum, spread over 11 visits of an average duration of 2 hours each. Latterly it was rather difficult for a prisoner to get to see him, and quite impossible if he had a complaint to make against any of the officials, which they thought he could establish. I have often thought that this gentleman's duties could be performed more satisfactorily for a less salary than £1,000 per annum. Before leaving the hospital, I will now relate a few of the conversations I had with some of the patients. "How long have you been unwell?"
"About 15 months."
"What is the matter with you?"
"Oh, my health has been ruined by the treatment I received in the Scotch prisons before trial."
"How long were you detained waiting trial?"
6 months."
"Have you been to the public works?"
"Yes, I was at Chatham, but my strength and constitution gave way, and for a working man I am now ruined for life."
"Did you enjoy your health before you got into prison?"
"I was never a day unwell, and was as stout and as fit for work as any man in the country."
"What will you do when you get out of prison?"
"God knows. I suppose I shall have to go to the workhouse. I am very willing to work, but if I don't mend I shall never be able to handle a tool again."
Another case. "How long have you been ailing?"
10 months.
"What is the matter with you?"
"Oh, I am dying fast. I was 7 months in a Scottish jail before trial, and that is what is killing me."
This prisoner died a few days after he uttered these words. His last hours were spent in humming over a Scotch ballad he had learnt when a child. Another case. "Well, what's your sentence?"
5 years.
"How old are you?"
25.
"What did you do outside?"
"I was born in a workhouse, and lived in it for 13 years, and I have now been 9 years in prison, so that I have not had much liberty to do anything at all."
"What do you intend doing when you get out this time?"
"I think I shall go hawking bits of things through the country."
"I am afraid you will find it difficult to make a living at hawking."
"Well, I have the prison to come to, where I'll always get my grub."
This prisoner had a delicate constitution, and in his case hard labour was a meaningless sentence, and imprisonment was no punishment to him whatsoever. To have made it more severe would have been all the same to him, as the hospital would then have been his perpetual abode. Some prisoners were in hospital nearly the whole of their sentence. One prisoner lay in bed with paralysis upwards of 4 years, and had to be lifted out to have his bed arranged several times a day. If he had been paid to commit a crime he could not have done it. Another prisoner was in hospital all the years I was in prison, and had been so for several years previous to my arrival. I only remember his being in bed a few days on one occasion. I was much interested in another patient, who ultimately died in prison, and whose history was rather a singular one. I shall narrate it as he gave it to me.
"I am what is called a herbalist, or herb doctor. I was brought up in a workhouse, my parents having died when I was quite a child. I had a great many brothers and sisters, all of whom died young. I had a very delicate constitution, and was thought at one time to be dying of the same disease as carried off my mother and sisters. The doctors gave me up as being beyond their skill. Well, I had begun to study medical botany by this time, and I at last discovered herbs that cured me. I now thought of curing others, and began first with some children belonging to poor people. I succeeded in almost every case, and as I charged nothing at all for the medicines, I was called out by all the poor people in the neighbourhood. At last my practice began to interfere with my employment as a weaver, and my master told me that he was willing to keep me and advance my wages, but I was on no account to have anything more to do in curing the sick. Well, I went round my circle of friends to ask their advice, and they unanimously agreed to support me among them rather than be deprived of my assistance. I accordingly gave up my place and opened a herb shop. I studied the properties of herbs constantly. I had no taste for any other employment. I tried the effects of all of them on myself first of all, and sometimes on my wife, before I decided on using them, and I dare say I may have done too much in this way in order to be able to assure my patients that I had first taken a dose myself. I have read all the books on the subject, in addition to my own practical experience, and I will not yield the palm to anyone for having a knowledge of herbs, I mean as to their medical properties. Well, I continued in my first shop for about 9 years, got married, and had a comfortable home. About this time a clergyman of my acquaintance happened to be removing to another county, a considerable distance from the town where I lived, and as I had cured his wife after all the regular doctors had given the case up as hopeless, he offered me 52L per annum if I would go to the same place as he was removing to and open a shop there, and I agreed. I was unfortunate the first year in not getting many patients, and began to regret that I had left my old abode, but by and by the news of my cures spread abroad in the neighbourhood, and I soon had as many patients as I could attend to. I never advertised a line, and yet I had patients as far away as Scotland. Ultimately my patients extended to the middle classes, and that was what brought me here. So long as I confined my labours to the poor, the regular doctors did not interfere with me, but when I began to take away their paying patients by the half dozen, they tried all they could to damage my character and get me out of the district. What is your sentence? 7 years, and I'll tell you how I got it. I sold a mixture composed of 4 different herbs, which is the most effectual medicine for certain diseases peculiar to females. In fact, it is invaluable to young unmarried women subject to the complaint I refer to, but unfortunately for me it has also the effect of procuring abortion. Well, one day a young woman came to me and wished to purchase some of this medicine. I had cured an unmarried female of her acquaintance, but before giving her the medicine I cautioned her not to take it if she was internecine, as it would procure abortion. The female who now applied to me wished it for that very purpose. Her husband was a sailor, she had been faithless in his absence, and she now wished to keep him in ignorance of her sin. All this, however, I learned only when too late. I refused to sell the woman the medicine, as I could see she was married. On being refused, she went to an old woman whose daughter had taken the medicine, and offered her 3L, if she could get her some of it. Of course I was not aware of this when the old woman came to me and asked me for some more of the medicine for her daughter, as she said. I sold her the medicine, which she gave to the sailor's wife. It had the desired effect, and she was well and going about in a couple of days. Her husband now returned, and the old woman demanded the 3L, which the sailor's wife refused to pay. Determined not to be beaten, she went to the husband and told him all about it. He called in the doctors to report on the case, which they did, adding that instruments had been used, which was altogether false. The medicine was easily traced to me. I was wrong in not having a written statement from every one to whom I sold the herbs, in order to have protected myself against any such charge as was now brought against me. The doctors are no doubt believed that instruments had been used, because they do not know the particular herbs at all, and no one in England knows them but myself, and I do not intend to let many know either. It's dangerous knowledge, but as God is my judge, I never used it wilfully, except for the relief of a disease that carries thousands of our countrywomen to the grave in the very prime of youth. I have been called to cases over and over again, after all the doctors had given them up, and I have often restored the pale hectic young woman in an advanced stage of consumption to health and vigour by the simple use of herbs, the best of God's gifts to man. What disease were you most successful with? There is one disease I could never cure, and that is ossification of the heart, but in the general majority of other cases I succeeded wonderfully. Sometimes, of course, I would be called to a consumptive patient within a few days or hours of his death, when life was so low as to render it impossible for the medicine to be taken. What do you think of the cold water system and homeopathy? The cold water may do for some diseases and for some patients only, but it is nonsense to think to cure all diseases in one way. I am not a quack. In America there are colleges for teaching my system of curing disease, regular teachers of medical botany. As for homeopathy, I think very little of it. I have known it succeed in cholera cases sometimes, however, as well as the allopathy. When patients have very little the matter with them, homeopathy or any other pathy they have confided in does all very well, and it fills the purse of the practitioners. But when real rooted disease has to be encountered, the herbs that God has given for the use of man are the only trustworthy means by which to effect a cure. To give you an idea how many are gulled, I may say robbed by regular doctors, I will give you the particulars of 2 cases which happened within my own personal knowledge. 2 men were seized with the same fever, and to all appearances the patients were about equal in health, strength, and age. I was called to one, and a regular doctor called to the other. The doctor allowed the fever to come to its height, as it is called. He made frequent visits, ran up as large a bill as he thought would be duly paid, and in 3 or 4 weeks the patient was at his employment. My patient was at his work in 3 days, and all it cost him was a few shillings. How did you manage to cure him so speedily? I never allow fevers to come to the height. I strike at the root of the disease. If you were going to build up a house that was out of repair and encumbered with rubbish, you would naturally clear away the rubbish first, and then begin your repairs. Well, that is just how I got to work with disease. Every pore of the skin must be cleansed, opened, and stimulated to action. The stomach must be thoroughly emptied and cleansed by a particular herb, and the bowels must be effectually treated in the same way. The house cleansed, I begin my repairs, which consists in aiding nature with the most powerful assistance given us by nature's God for that purpose, and the work is soon completed. I would undertake to cure 100 out of the 150 patients here in a fortnight. Do you think you could cure yourself? If I had 2 herbs here, I could prolong my days for a long time. I most thoroughly believe, but they can never touch my disease the way they go on here. I am dying by inches. The prisoner, now dead, was quite an enthusiast about herbs, and succeeded in imparting confidence in his abilities to the officers as well as the majority of the prisoners. He was to all appearance a man of good principles and a Christian. How far his own statements regarding his crime can be relied on, I cannot say, but that he succeeded in raising himself from being a poor weaver to be a money-making and successful herb doctor, I know to be correct. I have noticed his case chiefly in order to remark that he turned a good many of the prisoners into pill sellers, and incipient quacks, but he never would tell them about the abortion medicine, although he gave them prescriptions for almost all the diseases. I saw them all, and know the herbs had at least the merit of being innocent. Had he been less honest, and had the herbs which he prescribed been poisonous, I fancy that a good many of Her Majesty's faithful, loyal, and gullible subjects would, long ere now, have returned to the dust from whence they sprang. Chapter 17.
Chapter 18 of 6 Years in the Prisons of England, by a Merchant, edited by Frank Henderson. This recording is in the public domain. Chapter 18. In prison again. I see the prison director for the last time. Gentlemen prisoners. A will forger. A warning to others. Fenians. Treatment of political prisoners. Another jailbird. Having recruited my strength in hospital, I was again discharged to resume my work in prison. Shortly after my return to my old quarters, I thought I would inform my friends that some of the companions I met with at the commencement of my prison career, who had longer sentences than I had been fortunate enough to obtain their liberty, and in addition a free passage to Western Australia, which was worth about 20_l., and that I wished them to try and do something to aid me in my race for liberty. But my letter was again suppressed, and not being able by this means to inform my friends of my wishes, I entered my name once more as being desirous to see the director. I anticipated meeting the regular visiting director, who very rarely refused a prisoner the privilege of writing a petition to the Home Secretary, if he had allowed the usual time, 12 months, to elapse since he had obtained the privilege before. But I was even in this doomed to disappointment, and instead of the director I expected to see, I found myself confronted with the old sinister-looking friend I had been introduced to on a former occasion. I told him on making my humble request that I had not petitioned the Home Secretary for several years, that in fact I had not petitioned on the merits of my case at all, and that I would feel grateful if he would extend to me the privilege usually granted to all well-conducted prisoners of petitioning the Home Secretary. Conscience did not seem to be utterly powerless within him, for his eyes would not meet mine. They remained fixed on the desk before him, but his head shook, and his lips muttered "No." I pleaded for a moment in beseeching tones which might have softened a heart of stone, but Bassanio's appeal to Shylock was not more futile than mine to him. The words and gestures with which my suppliant attitude was spurned, roused all the manhood in me, and for an instant I felt as if I were a free man and addressing my equal, and in language at once dignified and firm, I requested a sheet of paper that I might appeal to the Board of Directors. My altered mien and tone of voice, so unexpected, so unusual in that secret court, arrested him. His hands trembled. He looked as Felix might have done when he first heard of righteousness, temperance, and judgment to come. My request was granted, and my last interview with a prison director had come and gone. 2 days afterwards I wrote a letter to the Board of Directors in suitable language, and addressed to the chairman of the board, preferring my request. Month after month passed away, but I waited for a reply in vain. At one time I would have felt both surprised and annoyed that no notice had been taken of my letter, but now I knew that I only had experienced the usual treatment which prisoners receive who have justice on their side. I had now made 3, and only 3 requests to the officials during my prison career, and all these had been denied, and I resolved to prefer no more. I gave my mind healthy exercise in the composition of verses, when I was not otherwise employed,
and to a great extent forgot my troubles in my puny flight to obtain a sight of the Poet's Mountain. The last year of my imprisonment was marked by the arrival of a number of Fenians, and the departure for freedom of one of the two of the very few prisoners whose society had been a pleasure to me. One of these had been the editor and proprietor of an influential country newspaper, and his crime was very similar to my own. He was a man of deep thought, and very far from being a criminal at heart. He was the best educated man I met with in prison, and eminently qualified for writing a treatise on the prevention of crime. The other had been in business in London, and had brought up a large and respectable family, having been accustomed to mix in the society of some of the most eminent of the city merchants and bankers. His company in such a place as a prison was a great acquisition. After the departure of these two prisoners, I had only one intimate and intelligent companion left. His case excited my sympathy, inasmuch as he was a very humble and penitent man, with a sentence of penal servitude for life, a sentence, I believe, inflicted not so much for the crime, but on account of the position the prisoner formerly occupied in society, as a warning to others. This is a formula which, in many cases, is made to sanction monstrous injustice, and in all cases, I may say, is practically inoperative. The only parties warned by the fall and punishment of such a one as the prisoner I here refer to are those in the same respectable position in life, because they are the only parties who have it in their power to commit the same crime. The punishment cannot warn those who are not in and cannot attain to the position which makes the crime possible, and who could not find the opportunity to commit it, even if they were paid to seek it. Then why punish such men as this prisoner the more severely, because he was in that position? I know it is urged in opposition to that view, that such men ought to know better, that they have no excuse, and so on, but we must bear in mind that all who do wrong know it, the poor and the ignorant as well as the rich and educated, unless they are of unsound mind. Then again, do those in a good position in society require more warning than those who have no character or position to lose? It would be difficult, I think, for anyone to maintain that position. The fact is, that convention merely, without any subsequent punishment at all, would be a much more effective warning to the former class than the gallows even would be to the latter. The thief plies his trade while the scaffold frowns overhead. It does not deter him, but the lynx eye of a policeman would, even although the penalty was a month's imprisonment instead of the rope. As I have already more than once asserted, it is the fear of being caught that deters the thief, and this fear increases and intensifies as we ascend the social ladder. In the case of all first offenders of the law, the punishment is an afterthought, and on that account, as well as on higher grounds, we ought to temper justice with mercy in dealing with all first offenders, more especially with those who offend against property only. In the case of the prisoner referred to, his crime would not have enriched him more than about £20, had he succeeded in escaping detention. He committed will forgery, and of course although the amount was small, still it was a great crime, but I think there might be other methods found for punishing such crimes than dooming the man who commits them to perpetual slavery. I take no notice of the fact that the prisoner in this case maintained his innocence. I assume that he was guilty, and I consider his sentence to be unjust and inexpedient. It is true that this man once sat on the bench and dispensed justice himself. It is also true that he once entertained the Queen of Great Britain in his own house, and these facts, to some extent,
determine the severity of his sentence. I find in them additional reasons for leniency, inasmuch as only a very feeble warning is necessary to prevent men in the position he occupied, and exposed to the same temptation, from following in his steps. I may now refer to the Fenians, of whom there were 6 who came into the prison during the last year of my incarceration. They formed a class of prisoners quite distinct from all the others, and their crime being also essentially different, the observation I have made with reference to the proper treatment of ordinary criminals do not apply to them. In the phraseology of the convicts, they were a "rum lot." They took rank between the aristos and the democrats, and formed an Irish brigade. One of them died soon after his arrival. 2 of them were head centres and enthusiastic in the rebel cause. Another was a literary man, Irish to the backbone, but ready to write for money on any side of politics. The remaining 2 were soldiers, one an American infidel, who cursed Catholics and Fenians alike for getting him into trouble. He called the Pope the King of the Beggars, quarrelled with the literary Fenian on the subject of religion, and true to his profession, enforced his arguments by giving his opponent what the convicts called a punch in the ear hole, and extracting the claret from the most prominent feature in his counting house. According to the literary man, Ireland had one great grievance, and if that were remedied, the Emerald Isle would grow greener than ever. "It is a splendid country," he said, "for growing tobacco, and if the Irish were allowed to grow that fashionable weed, they would be the most prosperous of peoples." A vulgar Scotchman suggested that Ireland would be all right if the Irish were scotched, and the Fenians all roasted on a gridiron. The irascible Irishman replied that a Scotchman was the incarnation of impudence, and hereupon a war of words ensued, until the officer's attention was attracted and brought it to an abrupt conclusion. The 2 head centres appeared to be intelligent men, but very unlikely to raise the standard or maintain the dignity of an Irish republic. One of them was said to be their ablest writer, but the other appeared the most loyal and enthusiastic Fenian of them all. With respect to the punishment of political offenders, the system of restitution which I have advocated would not be suitable, nor would imprisonment in the county prisons answer well. I should not object to government acting as jailers over such men, but they ought to be confined in a prison where they could exercise all their faculties for their own support, and their sentences should be the Queen's pleasure. Some of those in prison might be liberated at once, others not until the rebellion had been completely extinguished, and the government, not the judge, should regulate the period of their confinement. It may be said that the government have power to liberate such men now, when they choose, which is true enough, but suppose that the rebellion lasts or breaks out afresh in 4 or 5 years, and one of the most dangerous members of the fraternity becomes due for his liberation. They have no power to retain him. This power they ought to possess in all cases where the sacrifice of human life has been perpetrated, attempted, or contemplated. I would not allow this exceptional treatment of political prisoners to interfere, however, with the fundamental principle I have laid down of making all our prisons self-supporting. I returned to my numerous companions, the regular convicts, and the following specimens of some of them whom I met during my last months in prison may not be uninteresting. One day I opened the conversation with a regular jailbird, who had promised me some particulars of his history some time before. "Well, you promised to give me a little bit of your history this morning. Are you ready to begin?" "Oh, I don't know where to begin, and I have seen so many ups and downs, or rather so many downs and downs again, that I could not tell you a quarter of my history."
When did you begin to steal first?" "When I was a kid I was sent errands by my mother. She gave me money to buy things for her, and I cheated her often, and a fellow that cheats his mother, you know, is rather a hopeful youth. But to tell you the truth, I was partly spoiled by my mother, for she allowed me to do as I liked, and when I grew up I became acquainted with others like myself, and from prigging apples out of gardens I got to prigging pockets, and from that I got to be a screwsman and a cracksman. My first long sentence was 7 years transportation, and I never did a day's punishment hardly. In those days the legs went on board ship at once, and were liberated or handed over to a master almost as soon as they arrived. Well, I completed my time, was 2 years a whaler, and went and settled in New Zealand, and that was the time I had most luck. I was a brickmaker, and made money as fast as I had a mind almost. I remained in New Zealand about 14 years, and since I came home I have never had a day's luck. I went on the cross and got 4 years. After I had finished that bit, I went and lived with a mole I knew, and spent all my money. When it was done I went out to look for work, and met with a young fellow who knew what sort of a bloke I was. So he says, 'You are just the fellow I want, Bill. My master goes to the bank tomorrow morning and draws the wages money. After he draws it, he puts it in a drawer in his desk, and then goes out for about an hour, and leaves the office without anyone in it, and I have got 2 keys for the door and the desk, but as I would be found out if I attempted to take cash, I will give you the keys, and we will divide the spoil. As soon as the way is clear, I will hang out a handkerchief, and then you will know that all is right.' Well, I took the keys and went to the factory at the hour named. I waited some little time, and at last I saw the signal agreed upon. Up I goes to the door, as if I had a right to the place, marched boldly into the office, and before you could say Jack Robinson, I had the bag full of cash. Well, off I bolts to my lodging, changed my clothes, and counts nearly £100. I got the half as arranged, and never wrought a day work till all was spent. I spent about £1 per day. After that I took to hawking, and I might have made a living at it, but I got drunk, did a place over, and got caught in the act, and here I am." "How many robberies have you committed?" "Goodness knows. With the exception of the last time I was in New Zealand, I've always been on the cross." "What was the largest you ever got?" £500. "I understand most of these large robberies are put-up jobs, like the one you have mentioned." "Yes, most of them are. The risk would be too great if that was not the case." "Have you ever been flogged?" "Yes, severely." "How did you like it?" "Like it? Why, not at all, of course. Who would like a flogging?" "Would the chance of getting another flogging not deter you from committing another crime?" "I would as soon be topped as be flogged now, because a good bashing would kill me, but no fear of punishment would deter me if I saw my way clear to get off. I never do a job until I feel certain I'll escape. If I'm caught, that's my fault, and I must chance the punishment, whatever it may be. Another legging would kill me, but if I cannot get a living at hawking, I will be forced to go on the cross, and God help the man that tries to catch me. These places are getting so hot that a fellow had better commit murder and be topped at once." "If you had a safe, where would you place it to be most secure?" "In the street, and then your servants couldn't put you away." "How would you carry your gold watch if you had one?" "Well, I would have one with a patent bow, and I would take care not to flash my chain. If you keep your chain out of sight, you are pretty safe as long as you are sober, and every man who gets drunk ought to lose his watch. The thief should get a reward for doing that job. It's safer, of course, to carry the watch in the fob than in the waistcoat pocket, particularly if the chain is exposed, but it can easily be taken from any part if the chain is seen, unless you have a catch in your pocket to hold it. You know the way we do is to twist the bow of the watch and it breaks in a second. What do you get for a watch usually? From £3 to £6, according to the value of the watch. That seems a very low price to get for a good gold watch. Yes, but £5, I assure you, is considered a good price by the man who stands fence, and if a fellow can get 8 or 10 in a day, he may do very well at that. But I have not done any buzzing for a long time. I am too old for that game, and I can't afford to run a risk for £5. This hot work in prison will make thieves look after larger stakes. I would recommend you very strongly to go on the square when you get out, and not on the cross. You might easily make a better living by hawking than at this weary work, at all events. I mean to go on the square as long as I can do without working. I am not able for hard work, and I do not intend to do any more, neither in nor out of prison, but if I can't make a living honestly, you may be sure I shall not starve. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of 6 Years in the Prisons of England, by a Merchant, edited by Frank Henderson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 19. Prisoners' Conversations. Larry and Tim get into chokey. Big Croppy. What Pat gets in for. Malicious gambling. Pat's patent for getting a new coat. Dick's exploits. Ned's adventures and escapes. A new screw arrives. A prisoner empties the wine cup at the altar. Ned, Dick and Pat's opinion about badges. Classification. Head blokes. Prisoners. Aid Society and the Irish system. The following are specimens of the conversations which take place among the prisoners as they meet in the ordinary course of their prison employment. They were quite unaware that there was anyone near listening to them, or taking more than an ordinary interest in their remarks to each other, and my report may be taken as a perfectly accurate representation of ordinary convict conversations and phraseology. "Well, Dick, how are you?" "Oh, pretty well, Ned. How's yourself?" "Well, I'm among the middlings only. That beastly bad cheese they gave us yesterday hasn't agreed with me, and I think I shall hook it up to the farm for a week or two, and get a change of diet before going home. I'm only waiting to get a bit of snout, and then I shall send in a sick report. Have you heard what Larry and Tim have got this morning? Larry's got 3 days bread and water, 7 days penal class diet, and blued 14 days remission, and Tim's got 3 days. Well, Larry partly deserves it. He was a fool to let the screws see he had the snout. But what was Tim's offence? Speaking to a fellow in the ranks, and merely saying it was a fine morning. He'll get turned out of the cook-house too. It's a shame, when other fellows talk away in the ranks every day. I say, what day do you go home? I ought to go on the 2nd, but these licenses will be late again, no doubt, and very likely I shall not go before the 10th or 20th of the month. Have you any message for me to carry out? Do you remember Big Croppy? Yes. Well, he's been to my wife since he went out, and told her all manner of lies. He's told her that I accuse her of going with another man, and she has been to my mother and told her that she is not going to write to me any more, nor to live with me again. I have been to ask for a special sheet of paper to write and tell them that it is all lies, Croppy has told them, but the governor won't grant me paper. So, as I am not due to write for nearly 3 months, I wish you would call on my mother and my wife and tell them how things stand." "I will, you may depend upon that, and I'll get some bloke to give Croppy a pair of black eyes for his pains, the swine." Here comes Pat. "Well, Pat, have you heard that Larry and Tim have gone to chokey?" "Yes," replied Pat, But what screw reported Tim? That leather-skinned cranky old terror over there, reported Tim. And the bloke with the peg-top whiskers, reported Larry. That leather-skinned cranky old terror over there, reported Tim. And the bloke with the peg-top whiskers, reported Larry. Bad cess to the terrier. I have a good mind to punch him in the ear-hole. That would fetch a bashing, Pat. Troth, and I've had a bashing once afore, and what I have once I can do with again. Did you holler when you were bashed? Holler, by the piper, I sang out. The seeds of repentance, how can they root, when I'm ruled by a tyrant and flogged like a brute? The plant of revenge is more likely to sprout, when such monsters of jailers go strutting about. And I called them all the horrid names I could think on, and they were wild when they saw I was game. Where were you bashed? At Bermuda, and by the piper, they once flogged men before the altar there, and then called the prisoners into chapel, and preached them about forgiving one another, and showing mercy to one another. The hypocrites! What are you in for this time? Oh, nothing at all. I am like the bloke in the song. One day as I passed, I looked into the kitchen, where I saw a pot boiling, but not for poor Pat. For love and for thieving I always am itching, so I took out the mutton and put in the cat. I understand there was a great many unnatural crimes committed at Bermuda. Oh, shocking! The young lads would go about with their pockets full of money, and their hair decked up like girls. It was disgusting, 'pon my word. And do you know what the authorities called it when cases were brought before them? No. Why, malicious gambling. That was to deceive the public, you know. There was plenty of snout knocking about in all the prisons in those days, and a fellow hadn't to go a day without a taste as he has to do now sometimes. We used to have lots of rum at Bermuda, as well as snout, and first-rate liquor too, by the piper. I wish I had a drop now. How much could you do with? A wee drop in a bucket, about 2 hoops up. The last time I'd a drop o' rum in me, do you know what I did? I had on a very shabby coat, all torn at the elbows, and only one tail to it. So I spied a country bloke with his girl, dressed out in a new toggery. I says to my pal, I say, oh, shockady, there's a new coat on that bloke's back, and I must have on mine. He is just about my size. You go up and be messing about with his girl, and you'll see he will guard off and offer to fight. You take off your coat and put up your props to him, and get him to strip also. Well, I come up and see fair play, and while you're at the fists, I leave my tog and take his. Do I twig? Well, up shockady went, and my crikey! If you had seen how the bloke fired up when his girl was insulted, why, his coat was off in a jiffy, and it was soon farther off than he could catch, I can tell you. And after I got round the corner, oh, shockady gave into the bloke and bolted, leaving him in his shirt sleeves to escort the girl. That reminds me, said Dick, of an affair I was once in. When I was a lad I ran away from home. I was afraid to go back lest I should get a bashing, and that time there was a woman in the High Street of Edinburgh who took in lads situated as I was, and made them go out and steal to pay her for their lodging. There were about 20 of us in the house at that time I went, some of them wenches and some of them young chaps like myself. Well, one night we were rather hard up, and we wanted a good feed, so 5 or 6 of us set out, along with a great stout fellow, and we actually stole a whole sheep that was hanging at a butcher's door, and the big chap swaggered it home. The old woman had it put in the bed, and covered it with the bedclothes as if it was a sick person, and the bobbies found it there before she had time to get it cooked for us, and by jingo, we were all marched up to the lock-up over it. Well, I got 30 days over that job. When I came out of jail, I went to a fair in the neighbourhood, and I prigged a countryman's poke, as he was standing at one of those barrows where they shoot for nuts, and by the piper, the coppers saw me, and marched me off to the station. But just before coming out of the crowd I got twisted round a little behind the bobby, and I passed the purse into his pocket. Well, off we marched to the station, and when we arrived there the policeman swore that I stole a purse, and that I had it on me, and he saw me put it into my pocket. They searched me, but of course found nothing, and I got off. Determined not to lose the poke, which had a good many quids in it, I watched the copper and prigged it out of his pocket again. It was the same bobby as got me this bit, and I told him all about it then. "I once," chimed in Ned, "buzzed a woman on the fly, and got her poke with 18 bob in it. She soon missed it, and I saw her go into a shop, and watched her crying to the shopkeeper and telling him she had got all her husband's earnings for the week stolen. Well, I knew she was a poor woman by that, and I went up and asked her if she had lost a purse, as I had found one. She said she had, and I gave it to her again. Now, mind you, I was very hard up at the time, but I don't hold with stealing from poor people. Men that have more money than they know what to do with in a country where thousands are starving ought to have some of it taken from them. That I call faration. I once prigged a priest's pocket, and he collared me and said, 'Well, if you think you have a better right to that purse than I have, you may keep it.' 'Well, sir,' I said, 'I am very hard up, and as there are only a few shillings in it, I hope you will allow me to keep them, and by jingo, if the good old fellow didn't let me off, blessings on his head for it. One of the narrowest escapes I ever had was one time I prigged a poke with only 7 shillings and 6pence in it. The copper saw me and chased me like Jew. Well, I out with the money, pitched the purse away, so that it could not be easily got again, and one by one I swallowed the coins, and just as I was getting the 6pence down my throat, the bobby had a hold of me by the collar. Of course he was too late. I hadn't a rap in my pockets, but it was very near a legging for me. I had another narrow escape not long before I got this bit. I knew a gentleman's house where they laid out the breakfast dishes on the table for an hour before they took breakfast. During this hour the room was left untenanted, and the window left open to let in the air. Well, I bolted in and nicked a nice silver teapot, cream jug, and 1 or 2 other things, and off I started home, where I planted the articles and then went to bed. Shortly afterwards a bobby came to the door, and although I told them to say I was not at home, to get him kept from coming in, by jingo, I soon found he was coming to search the house. So I bolted out of bed like a shot, put my clothes into a drawer, and up I went through a sort of trap door onto the roof of the house, and perched myself behind the chimney of the next house, with nothing on but my shirt and stockings. I hadn't even time to get my trousers pulled on. Oh, didn't I sit shivering there till they gave me the tip that all was right in the house. The toff that owned the wedge made a dreadful song about it next day, and him wallowing in wealth. What do you think of that? The copper knew I did that job, and had me up on suspicion some time after, and gave me a drag 3 months over it. The next bit I did was a 6er, 6 months, and I escaped from prison in about 3 weeks after I got it. Soon after that I got this 7 stretch years, and by the piper, I'll take care and not get the next for nothing." "Oh, crikey!" cried Pat, "there's a new screw come. What has he been, I wonder?" "Where is he?" said Ned. "Yonder. He is coming this way, with a tall complexion, a Lego mutton whisker, and a pock-marked shirt," replied Pat. "Why, he's a big fellow." "Big? I should think he was. He is like a double-breasted beer barrel. He's been a screw at some other prison. You can see that by the cut of his jib." "Oh, I know him," said Dick. "He's from Dartmoor. He is not a bad sort of fellow, that. He is straightforward, and if ever he takes a prisoner before the governor, he speaks the truth, and you know they don't all do that by a long way." "How long were you at the moor, Dick?" "3 years, but it's not like the same place now. Oh, we had rare sport there at one time. There was an old half-barmy chap when I was there, who was once admitted to the communion, and it happened to be his turn to get the wine first, and by the piper, if he didn't drink every drop that was in the cup, and cried, 'Oh, that's fine! I do love this! I do love this!' We had plum pudding at Christmas Day in those days, and the roughs did anything they liked almost, if they didn't strike a screw. There was too much licence there then, but now it's all the other way. What good is this humbugging system going to do us? If they want to keep us out of prison, why don't they get work for us that we can earn a proper living at?" "Oh, they're a lot of jackasses, that's what they are. They don't know what to do with us," said Ned. "Look at this classification, and these marks and badges," said Dick. "Why, isn't it scandalous the way the public are gulled? First there were big leather badges that would cost probably £1,000 at all the prisons. Then these were done away with, and we had badges half the size, and then, after a few weeks, these were replaced by bits of cloth. I wonder what they mean by all these changes of dress. Do they think it punishes us?" "No doubt they do. What fools they must be! What do we care what we wear in prison, as long as it isn't thin rags that won't keep out the cold? Oh, have you read that article in one of the periodicals about the Andaman Islands?" "No." "Well, the bloke who writes it proposes to send convicts out there, and keep them for life, and compel them to marry prostitutes or female convicts, and then when the kids are grown to take them away from them. The fool! Why, all convicts haven't life sentences, and does he think that they would remain out there and do as he liked after the time was up? It isn't likely." "Why, that would be worse than the slave trade," said Ned. "And wouldn't there be a nice crop of murders there? Why, they would require to get a factory specially for making hemp ropes to hang the culprits." "Who is that writes the article?" asked Pat. "A government commissioner, but he does not give his name." "Troth, and I should be ashamed to give it if I was he. I propose he should be taken and compelled to marry a tail, and set it out to try it himself first. Why, such men are not fit to leave, and these are Christians. Those are the men who do unto others as they wish to be done by God help us." "Have you heard what the director did when he was down on Saturday?" inquired Ned. "A precious sight of good he does, to be sure," replied Dick. "Why, he has given orders that no prisoner is to be allowed to see him about the food and the marks, and you must tell the chief warder what you want to see the director about before you can be allowed to go before him. Isn't that a pretty thing? What a nice easy way of earning 1,000 a year the director has." "What has caused his fresh order?" "There were 2 causes. 3 of the convalescent invalids went to the director to ask to be able-bodied in order to get the able-bodied diet. They are doing as much work now, except they are not quite so long at it, but they are willing to work for the diet the same as the others. The director refused to allow them to work more, and of course they can't get the grub, and he gave orders that no more of such cases should be allowed to come before him. Another case was this. 2 fellows saved their cheese on the sly for several weeks, and in this way managed to have each about 4 cheeses besides them. Well, one of them told the officials what he was going to do, and the other kept his intentions secret. The first one went before the director and asked him if he would be kind enough to look at the cheese he had been supplied with for some weeks, and see whether it was the quality it ought to have been. The governor chimed in at once, and said that this was the only complaint he had heard about the cheese, and that all the other prisoners were satisfied. The prisoner was then bounced out of the room, and threatened with a report if he complained again. Well, The next man was called, and this happened to be the other bloke with the 4 cheeses. Before going in he took them out of his pocket, and what do you think they did? Why, he wasn't allowed to go before the director at all. They squared him and coaxed him, and at last persuaded him not to insist on seeing the director at all, by threatening to send him to the refractory cells for having 4 cheeses on his person, which was quite contrary to the prison's rules. Isn't it a bloody shame the way the head blokes go on? How can they expect a fellow to reform when they rob us of our food and show us a bad example? What o'clock is it, Pat? D'ye see the clock there? It wants 2:45, I say, Dick. Will you give me a mutton for a pudding? That beastly stuff lays heavy on my stomach, and I know you are fond of it. I don't mind, but how are you to get it sent to me? I'll send it by some fellow in our ward who works in your gang. I am hard up for snout, said Ned. Can you give us a bit, Pat? Upon my word, I've just had one old pipe head for the last 3 days, and it wasn't up to much. It had been too much used. Well, I'll lend you an inch or 2, but I hope you will soon pay me back. Why, there is none to be had now under a bob an ounce. But I say, Ned, if you should get another legging, I would advise you to declare yourself a Jew. You look something like a sheeny at any rate. Why, look at that old Chickalaccio. He goes twice a week to school, and has 2 Sundays every week, besides ever so many feast days. Oh, I can do another bit, no matter whether I am Jew, Turk, or Christian. But if I get an easy job, I mean to go on the square, upon my word I do. Who will employ you, do you think? Why, I shall go to the society. The society be damned, they will not do you any good. I believe it is under new management now, and they don't cheat a fellow out of his gratuity as they used to do. But I think it's a wrong name to give it, the Prisoners' Aid Society. The very cases requiring most aid they won't assist at all, and unless a fellow is stout and hearty, and has got some gratuity, they won't have anything to do with him. If I had only a few shillings coming due to me, they would not aid me, but as I have 5 or 6 pounds they will. Now, that looks suspicious. Then, if I had lost a leg, like that bloke over there, they wouldn't aid me. But if I don't go to the society, I will perhaps go to Ireland and give them a turn there. Oh, said Pat, you'll find nothing that wants lifting there. Have you been to Spike Island, Pat? Yes. What sort of place is it? And what about this Irish system? Oh, the place is something like the public works here, and as for the Irish system, I can see nothing in it, except that they get most of the prisoners sent to America, and if they would send us there, we might get a living too, without going on the cross. There are not many regular prigs in the Irish prisons. Many of them are fellows who get into trouble in some drunken row, and the people in Ireland are not so prejudiced against convicts as the English are. So that work is easier got. Another thing is when your time is near up, you are trusted a little, and get some liberty to go about. In this way the authorities can see who's who. Then the numbers are fewer altogether, and a small lot of men are easier dealt with, you know, than many thousands. It wouldn't work quite so well here, but the great thing is sending the prisoners abroad in some way or other. Do you know that Lafferty and Badger are going to be sent to New Orleans by the Catholic Aid Society? No. What will Lafferty do there? Oh, he must go on the cross, I expect. But Badger is able to work. He's a very good buzzer. Is Lafferty, mind you, and he might do very well out there. Well, the time's up, Ned. I suppose you'll be going up to the farm to-night, and we shan't see you again. Well, old fellow, take care of old Tommy's black draughts, and look after yourself when you get out. Goodbye. Goodbye, old fellow. Good luck to you. Fall in! There's the officer shouting, fall in. Well, ta-ta. Ta-ta. End of chapter 19.
Chapter 20 of 6 Years in the Prisons of England, by a Merchant, edited by Frank Henderson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 20 Capital Punishments. I received my licence. Strange bedfellows. My liberation. During the last year of my imprisonment, a bill relating to the crimes of murder and manslaughter was brought before Parliament, and the discussion in the House of Commons which ensued was much commented upon by the prisoners. About the same time I read a lecture touching on the same subject, which had been delivered to the Young Men's Christian Association at Exeter Hall, and it may not be out of place here if I venture to express my opinion on the subject as well, possessing as I do the advantage over most of those who have discussed it out of doors, in having heard the opinions of those likely to commit such crimes, and having a familiar acquaintance with their habits, and the motives from which they act. The reverend lecturer to whom I have referred based his argument for the continued infliction of capital punishment on the perpetual obligation of the Mosaic law. Whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. He also maintained, if I understand him rightly, that the office of the hangman ought to be considered the highest object of human ambition, and that the hangman himself should take precedence of archbishops, kings, and emperors, inasmuch as he occupied the position of Almighty God, taking vengeance for the shedding of human blood. I confess I can scarcely conceive of a Christian man occupying such a position, neither can I agree with the reverend lecturer that the command given to Noah was intended to extend to all generations and societies of men. When it was promulgated there were only a few individuals left to people the universe, and the command was made absolute. There is no intermission of any distinction between the deliberate and the accidental shedding of human blood, and until some such distinction is made, our concepts of the eternal rectitude and justice of God must be of a very peculiar and imperfect kind. That some distinction ought to be made is a fact, which men in all ages and of all degrees of civilization have recognized, and have found their authority for making such a distinction, not in any spoken or written law, but in a much higher and older law than these, the universal conscience of mankind. That such a distinction was found necessary as the race became more numerous is conclusively shown by the promulgation of the Mosaic law. He that smiteth a man so that he die shall be surely put to death, and if a man lie not in wait, but God deliver him into his hands, then I will appoint thee a place whither he shall flee. Exodus 21:12-13. This was a great modification of the original injunction, and also shows clearly, to my mind at least, that all human punishments should be regulated by the condition of the people for whose benefit they are designed. Again, in the same chapter from which I have already quoted, I find the following: Thou shalt give life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, etc. A law evidently designed for a semi-barbarous people, and admitting of prompt administration and summary execution. Turning to the Christian law on the subject we find, Ye have heard that it hath been said, an eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth. But I say unto you, that ye resist not evil. This would appear to introduce a new principle of forbearance, and if we refer to the case of the woman who take in adultery, where the legal penalty was death, we find that mercy, and not vengeance, is the principle on which our penal code ought to be based. But leaving scriptural grounds and descending to those of expediency merely, does capital punishment deter men from committing murder more effectually
than perpetual imprisonment would? I believe that 999 out of every 1,000 of our convicts even would not commit deliberate murder, although the penalty was only a few months' imprisonment and detection certain, unless under peculiar temptation or provocation. It is a crime naturally abhorrent even to the thief, and the majority of those men capable of committing wilful murder would on the whole, I believe, prefer to be hanged out of their misery than remain in prison all their life. If all hope of release could be utterly extinguished, very few of such men would chance perpetual imprisonment if they had it in their option. Of course we could not banish hope from the minds of all, and therefore many would at first cling to life, and after a few years seek death as a release from bondage, and even commit suicide rather than endure such suffering longer. I knew one prisoner who pleaded to be hanged, and others who would certainly prefer execution if they had no hope of ultimate liberty. The general opinion of those who had been in prison 10 or 12 years out of a life sentence was in favour of execution at once, and being the less dreadful alternative, so that with respect to punishment as a deterring influence, I have no doubt that perpetual imprisonment would be more efficacious than the capital sentence. Those who are capable of deliberately taking human life with the view of obtaining money may be divided into two classes. The one class comprising such as prisoners who perpetrate the crime cunningly and in secret, in the firm belief that they will escape detection. The other class are the highwaymen and garotters, who go daringly and violently to work, pretty sure in their own minds that they will be clever enough to escape. With regard to the former class, the deterring influence is detection. Capital sentence, perpetual imprisonment, or even a less severe sentence would operate equally in preventing the commission of the crime in their case, because the idea is not generally present in their mind when they perpetrate it, or is completely outweighed by the fear of detection or discovery. With reference to the second and bolder class, a lingering imprisonment would appear more horrible in their estimation and exercise an equal if not a greater deterring influence than the scaffold. Some of those men with whom I have met would glory in dying game, as they term it. Those who commit murder in order to gratify feelings of revenge usually, I believe, find the gratification of the passion so sweet that they are for the time quite regardless of their own lives, and when jealousy is the cause of murder, it often happens that the murderer takes the law into his own hands and visits upon himself the penalty. I met cases in point, and in none of them did the fear of the death sentence operate against the perpetration of crime. They had made up their minds to lose their lives, and did not calculate on escape. Such cases are not common, however, and perhaps it is not possible to prevent them occurring. Those murders perpetrated for the love of money might to some extent be prevented by the general elevation of the mass of society, and by increasing the swiftness and certainty of detection, and I have come, after long study of the subject, and from frequent contact with those saved from the gallows, to the conclusion that capital punishment may now be safely abolished in this country. In all countries where secondary punishments are severe and capital punishments rigorously inflicted, murders are numerous, and in countries where the machinery for the detection of crime is defective, it may be the same. Earl Russell, in a late edition of his work on the Constitution, expressed opinions on this subject with which I coincide, but I disagree with him when he prescribes imprisonment and hard labour as being the most suitable method of dealing with criminals not capitally punished. I refer, of course, to imprisonment and hard labour as generally understood. There are three systems of imprisonment: the solitary, the separate and silent, and the promiscuous association of all prisoners at the public works. The solitary system feeds the lunatic asylums. The separate system has its advantages, if not too long continued, and of the promiscuous association system I have already at some length given my opinion. In my humble estimation, a prison ought to be a place for extracting as much usefulness as possible out of a prisoner for the benefit of that society whose laws he has offended. But the hard labour in our prisons is not useful in any sense of the word, either to the prisoner or society. It is sheer waste of energy, which is in itself an evil, and it gives the prisoner an aversion to labour of all kinds, which is another and a much greater evil. Moreover, long imprisonments are injurious to the prisoner under any discipline. If you take a bird and place it in a cage and next day liberate it, it will ever retain a dread of confinement, but if you keep it in a prison for years and then open the cage door, instead of the sudden eager flight to freedom, it will hover round its little prison. Perhaps it will even re-enter it, preferring it to that liberty which it has lost the power to enjoy. So it is with many prisoners. Keep them confined, and accustom them for years to prison life, such as it is in the most approved models, or indeed under any conceivable mode of discipline consistent with unshortened life in such a place, and they will re-enter the world in a great measure, unfitted for the business of life. I remember having a conversation with an intelligent prisoner who was by no means a criminal at heart. He asked me what means would I recommend for the destruction of these schools of crime, for so he called the convict prisons. Sentence Charles Dickens to 10 years penal servitude and allow him to use his pen, I replied. Well, he said, I dare say that might do, especially if those intended for our future judges were sentenced along with him. But why should we not try to enlighten the public when we are liberated? You might do so, I replied, and I sincerely hope you will do so, but I fear, like the down of a thistle on an elephant's back, so would the words of a convict fall upon the public ear. Look at Napoleon III, said my friend. He is an ex-convict, and do his words fall lightly on the public ear? His is hardly a case in point, I said. The greater the criminal, or rather the higher the object he endeavours unlawfully to obtain, the less prejudiced is society against him. They regard these fenians, for instance, in a different light to us. Yet these men at bottom are or would be wholesale destroyers of human life, whilst we have no intention of doing any one any injury either in personal property. We are loyal, they are traitors. We would willingly lay down our lives to regain our lost character, and attain to an honourable and useful position in society. They will go out of prison rebels, ready to take up arms against all authority save that of their misguided chiefs, whenever they can do so with apparent safety. Yet these men will be more favourably received by society than you or I will be. You will find when you get free that your position will be very different from what it was, and that anything you say will be viewed with suspicion, as coming from a prejudiced and untrustworthy person, and a well-told falsehood by an official will far outweigh the whole truth if related by a prisoner. I could now prove, said my friend, by the blue books, that most of the reports sent to the Home Office regarding these establishments are unreliable, and calculated to deceive and mislead the public as well as the government. "You will require to be very guarded," I replied, "and above all things adhere strictly to the truth, and if you can gain the ear of some eminent man who takes an interest in the question, you might be the means of doing your country much service." In consequence of such conversations as the one I have just related, I was led to form the idea of giving this narrative to the public. If it should lead to any change or modification in our criminal law, conducive to the welfare and security of society, I shall consider that my labours have not been altogether vain and unprofitable. A change of government having taken place during the last year of my imprisonment, I had the good fortune to get a few months' more remission of sentence than might otherwise have been the case. While I feel truly thankful to those noblemen and gentlemen and other friends who interceded for me, my special gratitude is due to Mr. Walpole for the promptitude he displayed in acknowledging my claim to the few months' mitigation of punishment it was in his power to bestow. On a Friday morning I was unexpectedly called before the governor and informed that my licence had arrived. I was asked certain particulars in reference to my future intentions and address. I was next measured for a shoe, the only decent and honest article of clothing I ever received in prison, tried on a suit of clothes, and had my portrait taken. On the Saturday morning I was weighed and measured, and taken before the chaplain to receive a few formal words of parting advice. On the following Monday I was again taken before the governor to hear my licence read. On Tuesday morning I was removed to Millbank prison, and lodged there for the night, in a cell along with 2 other prisoners going to liberty like myself. We slept on narrow dirty mattresses laid on the floor, so close as to be touching each other. One of my new companions had been nearly 4 years in the lunatic asylum at Fisherton, and had recovered. The other was a young professional thief belonging to London, whose mind was just on the verge of insanity, through long confinement in separate cells. To sleep on the floor of a dusty cell between 2 such companions was not quite so comfortable as a bed in the Hôtel Meurice at Paris, where I had spent my last free night. Every moment that divided me from the hour of my liberation now seemed magnified into days. Wednesday morning at last dawned upon me. I was taken out and placed before a regiment of policemen, who each scrutinised me, and that done I received my licence. With feelings of inexpressible thanks and gratitude to God, I heard the heavy prison doors close behind me, and once more I inhaled the sweet free air of heaven. Tears streamed down my cheeks as I trudged along the streets in my shabby clothes and with my deal crutch. I felt a new punishment creeping over me, even whilst the glorious sun of freedom was shedding its welcome rays on my dishonoured head. With 19 shillings and 3 pence in my pocket, but with my reputation lost, my health ruined, alone and a cripple, whom no Prisoners' Aid Society would assist, I was expected to begin anew the battle of life. While I write these lines, the bitterness of my new punishment has already visited me. Repulsed from every door where I seek employment, waiting patiently for the replies to my applications for advertised situations, which never come, the brand of the convict has indeed become the very mark of Cain, and I feel as if my fellowmen shrink from me as they pass. Fortunately I found at the post office a few pounds sent to me from my brother, which, with slight additions, have enabled me to procure a mechanical leg, and to live till I have completed this narrative. But what is the fate of the many so situated, with no friends to help them, save the workhouse or the prison once again? A dreary life amongst paupers,
or a short life of pleasure and crime, and long years of bondage to atone for it? Do you wonder if some choose the latter? May you, gentle reader, never know what it is to lose your limb, your liberty, your character, or your home. May my history prove a beacon to warn you from the quicksands of ambition, on which so many human souls are wrecked, and may your little barque, rafted by gentle sunny gales, be safely steered across the great ocean of life, and at last be securely moored in that haven where blessedness and peace for ever reign. End of chapter 20. End of 6 Years in the Prisons of England, by a Merchant, edited by Frank Henderson. Recording by Elaine Webb, Bristol, England.